Welcome to the Mushoku Tensei Supercut, the complete collection of all my cut content for Season 1 Part 2. Part 1 I unfortunately only ever made 2 videos for, so if you're looking to get caught up on those, you might just have to watch the anime. That being the case, the order for this video will be the prologue, episode 1, then episode 12 and onward. It essentially skips the training with Roxy and the meeting with Eris, all the way to the first turning point and Rudy's whole journey to Windport. Now, without further ado, let's get started with the prologue. Rudy's past life was never something that I had really thought about. I had always kind of assumed he was just this antisocial outcast who unfortunately got bullied a lot. But after reading the details of the prologue, you'd be surprised to know that he was actually quite normal before. In fact, if not for one small decision during an early point in his life, Rudy could have become quite successful in just about anything. It was a core part of his past I'm surprised didn't make it into the anime. So, while I was going to do cut content starting from episode 1 onward, I actually found this backstory to be a bit more interesting. Which is why before we even get to episode 1, here's how Rudy's life was before reincarnation. If you're wondering how Rudy ended up the way he did in his past life, you'd be surprised to know that it all stemmed from one basic decision. A simple whim to build himself a computer had changed this man's life from promising youth to hopeless adult. What I mean is that before this computer, he was actually quite normal. He was born into a well-off family, had 4 other siblings who likely cared for him, then in elementary school he was even praised as being smart for his age. That didn't necessarily mean he was academically gifted, but he was skilled at video games and even quite athletic. It was a time when he got along with everyone and everyone got along with him. But when his time at junior high had come around, his passion for computers was only intensified through his participation in the computer club. So much so that he would obsess over magazines and eventually save up enough to build his own. This may not have seemed like a problem at first, but with every waking moment now being spent on this computer, it was only natural for Rudy to begin to neglect his studies. He started to believe they weren't necessary in order to have a future. Now, you'd think his family would have stepped in to intervene, but they were completely ignorant as to what was happening. I mean, even Rudy himself didn't realize the harrowing path he was heading down. That being the case, when the time came to get admitted into high school, the only one his grades could get him into was the school widely considered to be the worst in the prefecture. It was the place in which all the delinquents were sent to. Of course, Rudy, having been praised for a majority of his life, truly believed he would breeze through this no problem. His inherent confidence not only made him feel like he could do anything, but it also made him feel like he was above the rest of the so-called idiots he went to school with. So, when an incident had led him to talk down on those he thought he was above, the delinquents he targeted were the worst of the worst. Not only were they his upperclassmen, but it just so happened one was actively trying to be the school's #1 menace. It was his first and last mistake, as this would be the reason he was bullied out of attending school anymore. So, just as we saw in the flashbacks, after beating him senseless and tying him naked to the gates, pictures would then circulate and plummet his social standing straight to the Shadow Realm. His family would attempt the occasional positive reinforcement, but trauma like that simply wasn't easy to recover from. No, it was far easier to just ignore everything and remain holed up instead. At least there he could kill time with his computer and the internet. Now, over time, Rudy would take an interest in several hobbies, but none would ever last for longer than a year. Regardless of whether it was a blog, plastic models, or painting figurines, the moment he saw someone else could do it better, all motivation to continue doing it would just be lost. There was plenty of support and money given to help him find something that would break him out of his shell, but in reality, they were all just a means to pass the time. They were all just hobbies intended to help him avoid facing the real problem. Looking back, the ideal scenario would have been to become a manga artist or light novel author, but those were the very people he would always make fun of. He would actively consume their creations, all while relentlessly criticize them. Judge their works without having put work into anything himself. So, when thinking back on what could have been, everything past grade school was just regret. Regret that he didn't have more time. Regret that he half-assed everything he'd ever attempted. If he could just go back and really apply himself like how he did when he was building his computer, then for sure he felt he could have become a pro at something. Maybe not the best in the world, but at the very least good enough to have accomplished literally anything. These were the thoughts Rudy was facing just hours after having been disowned and kicked out of the house. As a 34-year-old jobless man who just missed his parents' funeral, his brothers and sister had come to evict him. First by delivering their letter formally disowning him, then by smashing his computer, which he valued more than himself. It was when he tried to fight back that his older brother, who was a black belt in karate, made sure to give him a full-on beating before finally removing him, leaving him on the streets to wonder what he even did wrong. Now, those few hours prior to the truck weren't just spent wallowing in self-regret, but were actually spent trying to come up with a plan for himself. If the ultimate goals were to get a job, find a place to live, and buy some food, then the first thing he needed to do was go to an employment agency. The only problem with that was that he didn't even know where any of them were. That and the fact that the agency only handled introductions. So, even if he was to get a job interview right now, not only did he not have a resume to show any experience, but he also didn't have the proper attire suitable for one. The impression he would make right now would just be miserable. Perhaps he could clean himself up with money from a loan company, but without a place to live, a resume wouldn't even be valid for him. So it was at this point that Rudy finally realized his life was ruined. He had wasted it all and accomplished nothing. Right as he had come to this realization though, a faint argument could be heard in the distance. It was the three high schoolers who were very clearly in the middle of a lover's quarrel. Something you'd be surprised to know was that this very sight brought back memories of situations very similar for him. Of course, memories not from middle school or high school, but instead junior high, which were when things were normal for him. It was a time in which Rudy did in fact have a chance with a girl. Since the two lived pretty close to each other, they were often in the same class and even walked home together. He didn't think that she had a crush on him, but if he studied hard and got into the same high school, then there was actually a good chance that the two of them could have ended up dating. In any case, the two would occasionally get into fights just like how the kids across the street from him were now. Or they would supposedly hook up if things went well. Either way, it was yet another reminder of what could have been had he not wasted his life away. Now, it was while these three students were arguing that Rudy would notice the truck barreling straight towards them. The pain in his ribs made it hard to yell, so the only other option was to run and help them. As much as he knew that helping was the right thing to do though, the main problem was not knowing how. Even so, what bothered him more was knowing that in 5 minutes he'd regret not doing anything again. So, rather than keep living the same way that he's always lived, Rudy decided that he would try to do something. Anything was better than constantly living in this state of regret. It would likely end up in him being dead, but if his last moments could be spent doing something, then that was a small piece of solace that he was willing to die with. So, as his broken ribs resisted his every action, Rudy would push through the pain and begin to run, actually managing to get there in time to save one of the guys. But right as he had pulled that person to safety, Rudy had come to realize that he couldn't stop. What initially started as a plan to simply pull this person back quickly changed into an exchange of placement when he found stopping his 100-kilogram body wasn't so easy anymore. So, despite actively avoiding the path of the truck, Rudy's forward momentum would still cause him to stumble into it. He did intend to save the other two students as well, but by the time he'd saved the first, the truck was already there and making contact with him. An interesting thing to note about the impact is that it wasn't the initial hit that had killed him. His excess fat had actually saved him from getting flattened, but after being bounced off the hood into a nearby wall, the truck would continue forward and pin him against the concrete, crushing his entire body and killing him on sight. So, unlike how they showed in episode 1, there was no scene on the operating table, just the accident then his new life. Episode 1, Jobless Reincarnation, covering chapters 1 to 4 from volume 1 of the light novel. With Rudy's accident having been covered last video, we'll start things off right from when he awakens in his new life, his reincarnation that he wasn't even remotely aware of yet. So, while his initial thoughts were all related to what the damage from the accident was, the only thing he could think of after was just how awful his life was going to be. I mean, not only did he no longer have a place to live, but he was certain the accident likely left him maimed in some way. It wasn't until a few weeks later that he'd finally realized he'd been reborn somehow. Once that revelation had sunk in, the next thing Rudy discovered was that this wasn't Japan anymore. In fact, the medieval aesthetic made it clear that he wasn't in any developed nation. Like, with only candles and oil lamps to serve as lighting, his first guess was that his parents may have just been poor. That didn't really coincide with the fact that they could afford a full-time maid, but perhaps she was just a relative or something. Either way, if his goal was to go back and do everything over again, Starting things off in a family that couldn't even afford utilities wasn't really the greatest foundation to work off of. Fast forward 6 more months, and Rudy could finally conclude that his family was in fact quite rich. You see, with such a massive house and a maid he determined was unrelated to them, he just assumed they were so far out in the boonies that the nearest power station couldn't reach them. It was a fact he was struggling to get over, as it meant he wouldn't be able to use a computer anymore. Of course, with magic being present instead, that struggle wasn't so much an issue as he became engrossed with that. He still couldn't say for certain that this wasn't Earth anymore, but after listening closely to the conversations of his parents, he started to realize the nouns he wasn't familiar with were actually the names of countries, regions, and territories. All places he knew definitely didn't exist on Earth. So, with this being a world of high fantasy unlike his own, Rudy began to see that what he previously thought as common sense didn't apply anymore. If swords and magic were the norm here, then those would be the things that would become the norm for him. He decided he would try his best to live as a typical person, doing the typical things any person in this world would do. It didn't matter if he stumbled along the way, because no matter what, he was going to forge his own path this time. His past self may have died feeling frustrated at the fact that he couldn't accomplish anything, but with this new life and the knowledge and experience from his last, this time he knew he could actually live life right. Thus bringing us to the start of his story. Now, one of the major aspects of cut content was the entire chapter that focused on their maid, Lilia. Specifically her backstory and how she ended up at the Grey Rat household. Long story short, Lilia used to be a royal handmaiden and guardswoman for the Asura Palace harem. She was quite skilled at her duties as a handmaiden, but when it came to actual prowess in combat, her proficiency with a sword was mostly average. So when an assassin had come for the life of the newborn princess, while she was able to fend them off, their dagger, which was poisoned, had caught her leg. And because this was a toxin intended to kill a royal family member, it wasn't the type of poison that could be healed by magic. No. The only reason she was even still alive was simply due to the immediate attention from both healers and doctors. Overall, there wasn't really any damage done to her daily life, but the poison did make it so that she couldn't run anymore. She was effectively limited to a lopsided walk. A degraded physical condition definitely not fit for a royal guardswoman. That being the case, it was only natural she'd be relieved of her duty. A pleasant surprise considering that she was expecting to be executed. With such thorough knowledge of the inner workings of the palace, there was no doubt she'd be a target for the people coordinating these assassination attempts. So, to her, that was probably the reason they were even letting her go free in the first place. She felt they were trying to use her as bait to lure out the enemy. Now, that all could have just been paranoia, but the truth of the matter was that she was just this disposable lowborn who happened to be brought into the palace. I mean, even she didn't understand how she managed to land a job there. But with nothing tying her down to remain, the only logical choice was to leave the capital entirely, resulting in her finally ending up in the Fatoa region. Now, finding a new job was rather difficult, since any place that could afford to properly pay a handmaiden was likely already well acquainted with numerous connections in the capital, making it likely her identity and location would eventually become revealed to them. So, with the primary goal being to remain discreet, Lilia stumbled upon her position in the Buena village, a small hamlet at the far edge of the Fatoa region where a low-ranking knight was looking for a housekeeper and midwife. The location may have been a bit far even for her, but with the knight possessing a name that she recognized, Lilia knew that one way or the other she'd be able to get this job. Reason being that Paul was a student of the same master as her. Back when she'd been studying swordsmanship 7 years ago, he had randomly showed up after being disowned. He trained and became this prodigy, but didn't stay long as he'd abruptly left in hopes of becoming an adventurer. It was a brief period of time that Lilia could only describe as a hurricane. So, with this natural disaster of a person having settled down and married someone, Lilia could hardly believe that it was even him. But if it was in fact the Paul from her past, then she had more than enough stories lined up as bargaining chips to use against him. Luckily, they weren't necessary as Paul welcomed her with open arms. Now, after Rudius was born, we all know that Lilia was rather repulsed by him. But it's the reason for that disgust that ties back to her past again. You see, it wasn't just his smile that disgusted her, but instead the things that devious grin reminded her of. It was the same look the ministers would give her when looking at her chest. The same smile that those in the capital who purchased young women as slaves possessed. So, with an unsettling demeanor that literally sent chills down her spine, Lilia truly felt that her body was at risk from a baby, much to the point that it could only be explained by something demonic. It reminded her of the time one of the Asuran princes had actually been possessed by one. He would roam around night after night all over the palace, then one night when an attendant went to retrieve him, he had actually grabbed a knife and stabbed her in the heart. This was the outcome Lilia was afraid of. Sure, Rudy may seem docile and calm right now, but the way he was currently acting was just as the prince did. She was certain she would wake up one night to find Rudy had killed everyone. It was only just a matter of time until it happened. So, with this being the way Lilia lived for the first year or so, fear would cause her to avoid Rudy and try rituals of banishment on him. Unfortunately for her, nothing would change his demeanor until the discovery of magic, specifically the textbook he'd found in the study. It was definitely still odd that a 1-year-old would stare at books all day acting as if he understood them, but this perceived intelligence made Rudy seem different. He no longer gave off this depraved aura that even his father didn't possess. A stark enough change that left her wondering why she was even so unsettled in the first place. Switching back to the perspective of Rudy, 2 years had passed in which that time was spent learning one of the most invaluable skills, the language. Since he knew just how valuable knowing English was in Japan, Rudy made becoming literate his primary goal. It was a task that became easier thanks to the 5 books he found in the study that one day. The first was a guide to the various countries of the world, the second a bestiary of the Fatoa region's monsters, the third a manual of attack spells ranging from beginner to advanced, the fourth a fairy tale centered around a summoner's epic battle against a demon to save the world, then the fifth the tale of 3 master swordsmen who delve into a massive labyrinth together. As we know from the anime, Rudy decided to focus on that textbook of magic, and it was here that we were given an extremely thorough look into exactly how the fundamentals of magic work in the world. It's not something I'm going to talk about right now, but if you are curious as to how this stuff works, I've already made a video covering most of it. As for the 4 core points that textbook covered, well, the first was the 3 types of magic a person can cast. The second, the requirement of magical power in order to use magic. The third, the 2 known ways of casting magic. Then the fourth, the misconception that the amount of magic someone can use is predetermined at birth. It's stuff we were all already pretty much aware of. Something that was cleverly shown solely through the animation was the actual feeling of what it was like to cast that magic. You see, the sensation that Rudy tries to emulate every time he's casting is the feeling of blood pooling at the magic's point of exit, then the manifestation of that blood into the magic he's envisioning. This was the process he would practice over and over. At first it was all with the help of an incantation, but over time Rudy came to find that that wasn't even necessary. He determined that putting oneself into the same mental space as how he'd cast it before was just as effective in reproducing the flow of magical power as the incantation. That being the case, if incantations were like the automatic version of casting, then silent casting would then be the manual version. He assumed it was something that just wasn't prevalent due to how mainstream incantations had become. If magicians grew up training with incantations their entire life, then the thousands of spells they'd come accustomed to using chants for would be impossible to do silently since their body just wouldn't know how to. There wouldn't be this association between the feeling in their mind and the magic they were casting. So that's why Rudy assumed there was no mention of it in the textbook. Now, it was 2 months later that Rudy would finally discover the full set of steps required to cast a spell to completion. It was a streamlined process that Rudy found could be modified in some ways. He didn't want to do anything too crazy just yet, but if he could master the fundamentals and continue to increase his reserves of magic, then he was pretty certain that almost anything was possible. He just needed to start small and work his way up. If he set goals that were too big for himself right from the beginning, then he knew from experience that that would only lead to disappointment. So, for the next year of his early childhood, Rudy would continue to practice his magic in secret, constantly building his capacity for it, all while mastering the art of silent spellcasting. The reason he didn't want anyone to know is because he still wasn't sure exactly how this world viewed magic yet. Yes, he did keep the textbook with him at all times, but he never read it in front of anyone since all he knew was that there could be witch hunts like how they had on Earth. He knew that likely wasn't the case, but just to be safe it was best to keep it hidden. It was the only for sure way to keep training himself in magic without any limitations. Now, once his parents did finally find out, there was a large part of Rudy that just wanted to avert his gaze and lie about it. But if there was one thing he'd learned during his time locked away at home, It was that getting defined when you'd done something bad only went to make things worse. So, rather than avoid the situation, Rudy decided to face Zenith head-on, admit to his mistakes, and show sincerity for doing so. If he could at least show sincerity, then that would most likely keep his parents' trust intact. There was time and time again where Rudy would tell lie after lie in his past life, but the only thing that would ever lead to was everyone eventually losing their trust in him. So that wasn't a mistake that Rudy was about to make for a second time. Of course, just like we saw in the anime, Zenith wasn't the least bit concerned about the damage he'd done. She was more so ecstatic that her son just proved himself to be a genius. If you look at it from the perspective of her, not only did Rudy just show he was capable of intermediate magic at the age of 3, but he'd also just shown he could read without anyone having taught him. It was a pretty impressive feat for just about any 3-year-old. It didn't really seem that impressive to Rudy, but he did understand why his parents thought so. It was just like how his previous parents treated his younger brother in his past life. So, with this being the event leading to Roxy, that's when we get to Rudy's phase as a student. Unfortunately, this is where we skip to episode 12, so like I said before, if you're looking to get caught up, it might just be best to watch the anime. But anyway, episode 12, The Woman with the Demon Eyes, covering chapters 1 to 3 from volume 4 of the light novel. One of the very first things that really gets highlighted in the novels is just how far Rudius has traveled since being teleported to the Demon Continent. His initial landing was pretty much on the exact opposite side of the map from where his hometown was. Then the last few episodes of part 1 were spent in this town here. Where we find Rudius now though is all the way down here in the Demon Continent's sole port city of Windport, a destination that took them the greater part of a year to arrive at. It was during this lengthy journey that Rudius and Ruijerd had taught Eris the demon god tongue as best they could. It's not like she could read or write in it yet, but she could speak it relatively fluently, which was pretty much the most important part of teaching it to her anyway. Other than that, there hadn't really been much time to teach her anything else. So not only was Eris not making any progress with her magic, but it was also likely she forgot all the chants for the spell she'd learned in the first place. When Rudius went on to talk about Ruijerd next, we were actually given a little more detail as to what exactly the red jewel in his forehead did. Apparently it worked like some form of radar, a sixth sense that could detect the presence of every living creature within several hundred meters, kind of like a permanent UAV or Blackbird. So when Ruijerd said that there were a lot of monsters in the water, he really wasn't joking since he could sense every single one of them. Now, after their time on the beach, the first place Rudius went was to the Adventurers Guild. He wanted to see what types of quests were available for what type of payment, mainly because he'd heard that quests in the Demon Continent paid significantly less than quests in the Millis Continent. So, since he was right at the border, he felt like it was useful to keep a reference of just how much more he'd be making. As for the difference between these two continents' forms of currency, well, the Millis Continents was obviously worth more. There were 6 types of coins, each with their own Demon Continent exchange rate, a conversion that really didn't motivate Rudius to want to work anymore. If the Millis Continent did in fact pay more for the same type of work, then there really wasn't any point for them to do quests anymore. Unless they had absolutely nothing else to do, quests were definitely no longer the most beneficial use of their time. For the ones that they did do before though, most were the short and simple B-ranked missions. Not because they weren't qualified for the A or S rank ones, but mainly because those were often highly dangerous and very lengthy. It wasn't uncommon for an A or S rank party to spend more than a week doing these very dangerous expeditions. So, to a logical thinker like Rudius, there were simply too many negatives to even consider them. Yes, there were special benefits for being at the S rank, but he personally didn't believe that it was worth the trouble, especially since the only thing they were interested in was money to cross the border. Now, after Rudius had gathered all the information he needed, he wasn't surprised to turn around and see that Eris had gotten into another fight. It seemed the more proficient she'd become with the demon god tongue, the more likely it was for her to lash out and fight someone. They were encounters that typically ended with the other person getting their face stomped in. Moving on to when they had gotten to the checkpoint, we actually find out that the reason a spurd costs so much to travel is mainly due to the high level of danger that comes with carrying them. If a spurd was to make its way to another continent, then there was no telling what type of damage it'd be able to do once it got there. So the high price was more like a precaution to deter against terrorism. Given that this was their current predicament, Rudius had actually gone and come up with 3 viable solutions. The first was to earn money through adventuring. but saving such a vast amount would likely take over a year. The second was to raid a labyrinth and retrieve a magic crystal, but even with Ruijerd's overpowered sixth sense, the dangers that lay within were still far too many. Yes, they could likely make all the money in a single go, but the number of traps in a labyrinth were something he didn't want to mess with, especially since Ruijerd himself seemed rather hesitant. The third and final option then was to simply find and hire a smuggler, an unlawful approach that Rudius felt he should avoid if possible. So realistically, none of these options were quite the ideal. The next point in the story brings us to Rudy's encounter with the Empress of the Demon World. As he was wandering down the back alleys of the port, Rudy had overheard a strange man offering a little girl food in exchange for following him. The instant Rudy realized that this was what the man god was leading him to, he instantly fired off a couple stone cannons to knock out the man confronting her. It was then that he saw the horns protruding from the head of the girl he just saved. As soon as 2 and 2 came together, Rudius immediately began to assume that this was a succubus. He thought that perhaps the man god was finally rewarding him for all his hard work. But after giving it a bit more thought, Rudius quickly remembered that succubi weren't even part of the demon race. You see, because they were widely considered to be the natural enemy of the Grey Rat family, Paul had made sure to teach him that they were only found in the Begarit continent. So there was no way that this girl could actually be one. No, she was just some demon kid in extremely skimpy clothing. After that distinction was made, that's when their conversation began to get a little bit interesting. Not only was there a few cut lines highlighting her relationship with the demon god Laplace, but there was also a bit more context given as to why she found Rudius disgusting. When she was finally able to get a good look at him, her blue eye of magical power had allowed her to see that his mana pool was actually larger than Laplace's. So, given that this was such a shocking development, Kishitika went on to ask a rather unusual question. She asked if he happened to have a twin that died in the womb with him. I'm not entirely sure what the implication of this question is, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't just asked for any random reason. If I had to guess, there's probably something regarding a human's birth that helps to determine their level of mana. It's the only logical conclusion given the context of the question. In any case, there was actually quite a bit of validity behind Rudius's assumption that this supposed demon empress was just a role-playing child. I mean, this was after all the demon continent. So it did make sense then that someone like the demon god Laplace would be seen as one of their heroes. Of course, Rudius knew the disgusting truth about what this demon god really did, but there was no denying the fact that he had successfully brought peace to all the tribes of this continent. Without his intervention, there wouldn't be any fixed places like Windport for these demons to call their home. So it wasn't surprising that Laplace was this great figure that children would want to roleplay as. In fact, it was actually a fairly common sight to see throughout his travels. On the other hand, despite Kishitika being a historic figure almost as prominent as Laplace, Rudius couldn't say he'd ever seen any kids trying to be her before, leading him to the conclusion that we saw in the anime. When Kishitika went on to offer him his reward next, she made sure to clarify what each of the eyes did before having him choose the one that he wanted. You see, Rudius only knew of the eyes that turned people to stone, but because Kishitika was such a young reincarnation of her former self, she didn't yet possess any of the extremely powerful ones that she used to have. Of the ones that she did have though, first were the most common Eyes of Magical Power, a type of eye that allowed its user to see mana directly, and it was this type that was possessed by approximately 1 in 10,000 people. Next were the Eyes of Identification, which pretty much worked like an encyclopedia. Not only would they identify the object that the user was looking at, but it would also provide extensive details regarding what it was. The only downside though was that those details had to come from the user's already existing knowledge. After this was a pair of eyes that Kishitika knew was practically perfect for Rudy. You see, these were the Eyes of X-ray vision, and while they did indeed allow its user to see through inanimate objects, they also didn't let them see through anything that was living or surrounded by high concentrations of mana. So I'm sure you don't need me to tell you what exactly Rudy would be using these eyes for. Kishitika then went on to the far-seeing Eyes of Distant Sight, a pair that allowed its user to see things from very far away, but at the same time made it very hard to focus. They really weren't that useful for anything other than extremely long-range recon. Next were the future-seeing Eyes of Foresight, then the last were the mana-consuming Eyes of Absorption, both of which had their own ups and downs, but the fact that the Absorption ones consumed the user's own mana did make it objectively worse than the Foresight one. So, with that being all the options, Rudius found he couldn't quite decide on only a single one. It was a tough decision that led him to ask if Kashidaka could give him two. This wasn't a request that she really minded accepting, but it also wasn't one that she recommended. Reason being that having two demon eyes made it incredibly hard to focus, much to the point that he probably wouldn't even be able to see out of them. If he spent the next 100 years training, then it definitely was possible that he'd be able to control them. But for a child like him who was only just getting into his teens, having two would most definitely make him lose his mind. That's why people like Ghislaine who only have one are often seen covering their demon eye with an eye patch. So, as Rudius continued to ponder which one would be the most effective, there was only one that gave a very clear advantage. Distant sight wasn't something he really needed, and absorption was too much of a detriment than it was an asset. Identification wasn't all that useful given Rudius's current knowledge, and magical power was far too common for him to choose over all the others. Then X-ray vision simply meant he would constantly have to see Ruijerd naked. So that left only the Eye of Foresight, a power Rudius obtained after entertaining what he thought was just the playful mind of a little girl. How he saw her now, though, was more like this magical girl who was being led on by the law of cycles. Now, as for how this demon eye worked, well, the basic premise was that there were two types of focus, both of which were controlled via the way that mana was being channeled into it. The first was a type of focus that controlled opacity. When this was at its max, everything he saw appeared completely doubled, giving him a highly distorted vision of reality that was way too hard to distinguish. If he was to shift that mana more towards the inner part of his eye though, that's when that opacity would be down to its lowest, effectively minimizing the visibility of the future doubles that he would normally see. Because seeing into the future was so beneficial though, Rudius decided to keep the mana channeled in a spot slightly above the minimum. That way he could still see glimpses into the future, all while not being entirely distracted by how it distorted his vision. It was a level of mastery that only took 3 days of training to keep consistent. With that being the first type of focus, it would then make sense that the second was a type of focus that controlled latency, the aspect of his eye that determined how far or how little into the future that he could see. With 0 mana being channeled to the forefront of his eye, the most Rudius could see forward was only a second. But by focusing more and more mana into that specific area, he was able to start seeing upwards of 3 to 5 seconds. The longer he tried to look into the future though, the more branches of reality he would see and the more blurry the image would become, essentially turning his vision into a completely incomprehensible mess of potential futures. It also taxed the brain to the point that it would give him a headache. So, after another 3 days of training, Rudius had finally learned how to consistently and safely see 1 second into the future. He now possessed proficient mastery over both the type of focuses his new demon eye provided for him. Now, while we did get to see how useful this eye was against Eris, we unfortunately didn't get to see how someone like Ruijerd could beat it. You see, just because Rudius could see 1 second into the future, didn't mean that it was a future he could always react to. Plus, depending on what or who he was looking at, there was always the chance that they themselves would be fast enough to blur his vision with different potential possibilities of the future, which is exactly what happened during his fight with Ruijerd. When Ruijerd had gone in for his initial attack, Rudius was able to dodge it much like how he did to Eris. But it was after that initial movement was made that Ruijerd began to initiate his own counter, a rapid motion that blurred Rudy's vision with 2 completely different futures. In one there was a Ruijerd who grabbed his arm, and the other was a Ruijerd who caught his face with a punch, neither of which Rudy could avoid since he was already caught in the motion of dodging. So even though Rudius could see exactly what Ruijerd was going to do, there wasn't anything that he could do to stop it, resulting in Rudy's face being treated like a volleyball. If you're wondering what exactly had happened, well, Ruijerd's skill had allowed him to come up with multiple options during the fight. If Rudius was to defend with his hand, then Ruijerd was ready to grab his arm. If he didn't do anything though, then Ruijerd would simply finish the fight with a punch. Those were the 2 outcomes in which Rudy envisioned because they were the 2 actions Ruijerd had committed himself to making. It was a gap in experience that no level of foresight could help prepare him against, making it very clear that the eye did in fact have its weaknesses. Moving on to the scene with Eris and Rudy. Aside from Eris leaning up on him like how we see in the novel, there was a lot more self-reflection going on during his conversation with her. While normally this type of situation would get his heart racing a mile a minute, Rudius could only feel ashamed for having been dishonest. He completely agreed that this new power of his wasn't fair to Eris. So, despite it being something he initially felt that he could rely on, Rudius Rudius decided right here that he wouldn't. He decided it was best to only use it as his trump card. To do anything else with it would most likely end up turning it into a crutch, an undesirable outcome that he almost failed to even consider. Now, if you're confused as to what exactly was going on during the events of episode 2, well, a lot of the context for the whole prison break was skipped when they decided to not show Gallus's offer. You see, Gallus was a member of a smuggling organization that he was trying to look out for. But despite his best advice, the higher-ups still went and decided to smuggle some goods that he knew would get them into trouble. Yes, it would sell for an exorbitant price, but there was no doubt the trade would come back and haunt them. So, in an attempt to save his friends, Gallus decided to make a deal with Rudy. In exchange for the safe release of those goods, Ruijerd could tag along on the next ship over to the Millis continent, a deal that resulted in the events we saw from episode 2. Starting things off about halfway through episode 2, we learned that the reason Rudius's journey wasn't interrupted like the way he imagined was mainly due to the presence of the S-ranked escort party Aqua Road. You see, in the event any of these fantastical threats did make an appearance, then this S-ranked group of adventurers would be sure to dispatch them quickly and efficiently. So, on the 4th day when an octopus had actually tried to attack, unlike how Rudius wanted the encounter to go, the adventurers instead put on an impressive display of teamwork to eliminate it. What's interesting to note about each of them individually is that none were quite as powerful as what Rudius had imagined. Their swordsman and warrior were nowhere near as strong as Ruijerd or Ghislaine, and their mage wasn't even close to the level that he was at. It was a perplexing sight that made him wonder how exactly these people had made it to the S rank in the first place. But after seeing them work as a unit to defeat this much larger opponent, that's when Rudius realized that it was their team that was S-ranked. Sure, individually they may not be very strong or powerful, but when they worked together as a team and each person fulfilled their role, that's when they really started to show their true strength. It was the exact opposite of how their own party was. So, as Rudius began to think about what his own party was lacking, it was clear from the display in front of him that that missing piece was teamwork. As they were now, Ruijerd's past experience as a squadron leader was the only thing carrying them. His presence was so oppressive and dominant on the battlefield that even if Rudius and Eris made a mistake, there was no doubt that he'd be there to cover for them. That being the case, Rudius knew all too well that him and Eris weren't even needed. He understood that Ruijerd was strong enough to take care of things on his own. It was a mindset that resulted in him approaching all their fights with the wrong mentality. Because he knew Ruijerd would always be there to protect them, there was never the feeling that him or Eris were truly in danger. So all the battles they'd fought up until now weren't really team battles like the one he'd just bore witness to. It was more so just 3 individually powerful people fighting in close proximity to each other, one of which would always swoop in to the rescue whenever it was needed. Now, when it came to Eris, despite being able to follow orders fairly well, her tendency to focus solely on the target in front of her made her less likely to cooperate the longer the battle went. She'd become far too focused on whatever monster she was fighting, kind of like a trash ADC that tunnel visions on the O10 enemy support during a teamfight. So, whenever that would happen, even if Rudius was to call for cover, Eris probably wouldn't respond since she wasn't even listening. This was the current state of their party, and it was pretty clear that without Ruijerd placing them into his backpack, neither him nor Eris would be able to survive a single fight together. They simply lacked the teamwork to properly support each other. Now, once the two of them had arrived at the port city of Zant, there was quite a bit of trouble finding a nice place to stay because of what's known as the rainy season. You see, every year for approximately 3 months straight, the Great Forest and the areas surrounding it would be hit by continuous unceasing rainfall. It was a rare phenomenon that brought with it monsters and materials that adventurers liked to harvest. So, as a result, many inns had been fully booked by adventurers for the next 3 months. While this was an opportunity Rudius knew they could use to cover their travel costs, more importantly, it was an extra factor that he needed to consider. It was a significant hindrance that would undoubtedly stop any sort of travel dead in its tracks. So ideally, Rudius would prefer not to get stuck in the middle of nowhere during it. Before he could formalize any sort of plan though, the first thing he needed to do was go get Ruijerd and fulfill Gallus' request. Remember, in exchange for bringing Ruijerd over to Millis, Gallus had requested that certain goods be rescued and freed from imprisonment. He didn't really specify what exactly those goods were, but the only slaves Ruijerd could detect were the 7 beastfolk currently being kept alongside him. So, throughout this whole scene in which Ruijerd was declaring his intent to kill everyone, we find out that Rudius wasn't really concerned with the fact that people would be dying. He was more so concerned over how it would affect the Spur's reputation. That being the case, rather than think on what to do like how we saw in the anime, Rudeus simply told Ruijerd not to leave a single survivor. That way no one would be left alive to leak anything about what had happened here. What Rudeus was getting a little hung up on though was the possibility that he himself may have to kill someone. You see, up until now Rudeus had never been put into that situation. When it came to fighting other people, he'd simply reduce his stone cannon's power to a level at which it couldn't kill anyone. So, while he did believe that he'd mentally prepared himself enough to be able to do it, the truth of the matter was that he couldn't. No matter how much he believed he'd be capable, there was nothing he could do to prepare himself to take another person's life. He may not have realized it up until now, but this simply wasn't a line that he was willing to cross yet. Now, after Ruijerd had taken care of all the dirty work, the rest of the rescue was pretty much as we saw. The only other thing that the anime didn't really show was the fact that the sacred Shiba Inu could actually understand him. You see, even after freeing the dog from its magical barrier and chains, it was still very cautious over Rudeus' presence. As soon as Rudeus started talking to it in the beast god tongue though, that's when the dog stopped its growling and became a bit more cooperative, leading us to the ending that we saw in episode 2. It was after this that we were actually given quite a few more details regarding what Ruijerd was doing. While he was concerned that Rudeus was taking longer than expected, he was completely confident that he could take care of himself. Even if there were some enemies left behind, Ruijerd had complete faith that Rudeus couldn't be defeated. At least not if he used the full extent of his power anyway. So, as Ruijerd set those troubles to the back of his head, the next issue was trying to figure out what to do with these children. Sure, he could just walk into town without a care in the world, but the last time he did that with some clearly misplaced children, the guards didn't hesitate to think that he was a slave merchant. Of course, that was before he covered up all his frightening features, but just the possibility of being stopped for questioning was more than enough to lead to a less than ideal situation. As he continued to ponder what to do next, that's when his sixth sense picked up a very strong aura approaching with incredible speed. It was something Ruijerd knew that he couldn't take any chances on, so rather than wait and see what this presence was, he decided he would strike it down in a single blow. To him, the winner of this fight would be determined by whoever struck first. But right as Ruijerd was about to swing his spear, the aura that revealed itself to be an elderly male beast person skillfully stopped himself just short of Ruijerd's range. Then, before the two could even say a word, the beast children hiding in the back rushed out to see that it was their grandpa, resulting in the solution to Ruijerd's problems coming to him. So, not only was he able to drop off the children with someone reliable, but he was also able to find out what happened to Rudeus. At first, Ruijerd was about to let the old man leave without asking anything. But because he remembered his aura had come from the direction of the smuggler's hideout, Ruijerd quickly asked if they'd found anyone else in there. When the old man answered that they'd found a boy, Ruijerd immediately wanted to know if they'd killed him. You see, if the old man had answered yes, then Ruijerd wouldn't have hesitated to kill him right there. Regardless of whether it was a misunderstanding or not, Ruijerd would have made sure to get his revenge. Of course, not before returning the children and getting Eris, but revenge was going to be a certainty no matter what. Since that wasn't the case though, Ruijerd instead decided to leave things be. The old man did tell him that Rudeus would be imprisoned and interrogated, but since the extent of his imprisonment was just being butt naked in a cell, Ruijerd had no problem letting him tough it out for a few days. His priority was now completely set on Eris and the children. So, as Rudeus went through what he believed was their version of psychological torture, he made sure to discreetly use magic to make things a little more comfortable for himself. He would use the fire spell Burn in Place to keep himself warm, then he would also combine wind and fire to create a warm current that would keep the cell a nice toasty temperature. After the first 2 days of waiting though, that's when Rudeus decided to do a little bit of scouting. His anxiety would no longer allow him to stay in place like how he wanted to. So, what he did instead was open his cell and walk around for a bit. He was taking notes on potential escape routes should the time come for that. Of the observations he made, his main conclusion was that a stealthy escape likely wasn't possible. You see, because his cell was so high up, there was no doubt that someone would eventually see him as he tried to make his way to the bottom. Plus, since he had no idea where he was, he didn't have confidence that he'd be able to find his way back. All he knew was that he was a 6-hour sprint away from where he previously was. That being the case, Rudeus decided it was best to stay put for a little while longer. But it was because of the sheer boredom of his current situation that we see him treat the new guy Geese in the cocky manner that we see in the anime. That was literally the only reason why Rudeus was acting so full of himself here. Now, for a bit of context on what Geese was doing here in Doldia. Well, apparently he was searching for one of his old acquaintances. We don't know exactly who she is, but according to Geese she was supposed to be from this village. It was only after he found out that she wasn't here that he decided to do a bit of swindling during his gambling. What Rudeus found interesting about this situation, though, was that it didn't make sense for them to put a small-time criminal like Geese together in a cell with a big-time offender like himself. It was a turn of events that just didn't seem right, especially since Geese had mentioned the norm was to simply send criminals back to Xantaport. Before he could think about this any further, though, that's when Rudeus noticed that the forest was on fire now. It was the perfect distraction to give him and Geese the opportunity to escape. Of course, the flames made it very difficult to tell where he was going, but he couldn't just extinguish them since that would significantly reduce his chances of escaping. So, as he ran around trying to find a path of exit, there was a cut scene in which Rudeus had actually saved a child prior to stumbling upon the kidnappers. It's not anything entirely special, but it did let Rudeus know that the village hadn't been entirely evacuated yet, leading him to make the decision that putting out the fire was the best course of action now. With regards to the spell that he did to do that, well, it was actually just an advanced level water spell called Squall. Yes, it was similar in nature to Cumulonimbus, but the main focus of this spell was to simply make it rain. So, as Rudeus channeled vast amounts of mana, he then compressed it as much as he could in order to form it into clouds. He would then focus on expanding those clouds horizontally, all while holding the accumulating precipitation until the very last second. As soon as the cloud looked as if it was big enough, all that was left was to release the spell and watch as this massive sudden downpour did what it was supposed to. It was a level of precipitation that had practically flooded the entire area in a matter of seconds. Now, in the ensuing fight after, Rudeus had used the spell Quagmire to entrap many of the kidnappers. It was a move that made for some pretty easy target practice since all he needed to do now was knock them out with the usual stone cannon. While the first few enemies did go down pretty easily, their numbers were far too many for Rudeus to handle alone. Luckily for him, the opening he provided with the rain gave ample time for backup to show up. So, as soon as Rudeus had grouped up with the Beastmen, the first person they'd saved was actually the Beast Woman who'd been guarding his cell. She was surrounded by 3 humans who seemed to be enjoying their time tormenting her. Before they could do anything else though, Rudeus had quickly knocked one of them unconscious with one of his stone cannons. Then the other 2 were immediately cut down before they could even react. When this beast woman saw that it was Rudeus who was helping, she was still a little reluctant to simply accept it. I mean, to be fair, he was still practically naked. Unlike how in the anime he had his equipment, the only thing Rudeus had on here was a fur vest that Geese had given to him. So not only was Rudeus fighting this entire time completely exposed, but he also didn't have Aqua Hartia to support him either. In any case, it was after Rudeus had healed this woman that he then went with the other beastmen to go rescue the children. Because he wasn't fast enough to keep up though, he was literally carried on their backs the entire way, essentially turning him into a mounted turret that would shoot stone cannons at whatever enemy they came across. Once all the kidnappers were dispatched, the only one left was the mastermind Gallus, the leader who we learn had tried to play both sides to his own benefit. For a bit more context on why his plan was actually pretty genius though, well, there was an additional factor beyond Rudeus and Regerd simply being a distraction. An element of timing that coincided with the upcoming rainy season. You see, if Gallus and the children were able to make it outside the village like how he planned, then pursuit would have been extremely difficult because of the rain. With many warriors already being occupied with preparations for the rainy season, by the time the village could have organized a force to go after his trail, the rainy season would have already been in full force and leaving the village would be practically impossible, especially if Gallus had already crossed back to the Demon Continent. So, this was a very carefully crafted plan in which Gallus was hoping to reap all the rewards from. To add that little cherry on top too, by using Rudeus to release those goods from the hideout, Gallus had also managed to eliminate his competition. So, not only was he able to bolster his own supply of products, but he had also managed to maximize profits by cornering the market on it. Now, an interesting aspect about Gallus's North God style of fighting was that his swordplay around the hostage was completely planned. All the techniques we saw the moment he started the fight were tactics that he learned for fighting while using a hostage. It was an approach to battle that was unique to the North God style. Considering how this was such a dirty tactic to use, Rudeus began to understand why Paul wasn't so fond of it now. It was made pretty clear from the scene in front of him that the North God style was filled with all sorts of shady tricks and schemes, deceptive elements that definitely took away from the chivalry of a fair battle, thus the reason why Rudeus wanted to avoid one. Funnily enough though, the only reason Rudeus had ended up fighting Gallus at all was mainly due to a misunderstanding on Gallus's part. You see, when the Sacred Beast had attempted to attack Gallus, Rudeus's shockwave was simply meant to split them apart. He was really just trying to help Gallus there. But as we saw, Gallus ended up perceiving it as a sneak attack, resulting in the ensuing battle that we see in the anime. Now, with that being pretty much the same, there's really not much else to talk about regarding the end of episode 3. There was a lot more detail given for the smuggling organization's master plan, but I believe that's something we'll get at the beginning of episode 4. Long story short though, the whole endeavor was a massive joint operation intended to capture the sacred beast. Literally every kidnapper in the surrounding area was hired to be a part of it. First, they left the villages alone to get them to lower their guard, then a few weeks prior to the start of the rainy season, every kidnapper would launch a simultaneous raid on all the villages except for Doldia. That way Doldia would have no choice but to send out their own warriors to help the others. So, with Doldia having their own shortage of defenders, that's when the smuggling organization would strike with its own elite forces, resulting in the capture of both the sacred beast and 50 of their children. Everything that happened after was all a separate plot that Gallus concocted himself for his own profit. So it didn't matter how many comrades he needed to throw under his foot, since all that mattered to him was his own personal gain. Starting things off with episode 15, we find Rudy and the others stuck in the forest for the duration of the rainy season, a 3-month period of consistent and unceasing rainfall. Of course, Rudy could have just used his magic to make it stop, but Roxy had taught him that doing so was dangerous. Manipulating weather when it wasn't necessary could cause some pretty negative repercussions elsewhere in the forest. So, despite Rudius wanting to hurry up and leave, the 3 months of rain was something he just couldn't avoid. After the first 2 weeks, Rudius had finally learned the type of magic that was used to incapacitate him. It was a secret Doldian magic that centered around the manipulation of sound. While the most basic of uses was a howl that located enemies, some more advanced techniques did include the one that caused Rudius to lose his balance. Now, Rudius did try to get Gustav to teach him how to do it, but it quickly became apparent that this type of magic depended solely on the unique vocal cords of the Doldia. So, no matter how many times Gustav showed him how to do it, it simply wasn't a type of magic that he could replicate. He did, however, learn that it was possible to channel mana into his voice now. After about another week, that's when several monsters had started to appear throughout the village. And while normally these monsters would be handled by the village's guardians, the smuggling incident had left them down quite a few. Luckily for them, Rudius together with Rurijerd were able to help with the hunting. They would use Rurijerd's 6th sense to track the location, have Rudius kill them with magic, then sell the corpses back to the village for money. It was a beneficial cycle in which both parties would profit from. The only person who didn't seem to approve though was Rurijerd and his strong sense of warrior pride. You see, he was personally of the mindset that the village's defenses shouldn't be handled by anyone other than the residents. To him, entrusting such an important responsibility to an outsider was a disgrace, something he knew the beast folk certainly wouldn't have approved of several hundred years ago. Now, 1 month into the season, there was actually a moment when Rudius had considered his family for once. He was thinking about how he'd finally be able to write a letter back home. It's not like he'd never considered it before, but it was much more likely the letter would make it from the Millis continent rather than the Demon continent. That's why he'd waited up until now to do it. 2 more weeks later, and Rudius had come to gain a better understanding of what the beast folk were. The term wasn't just an all-encompassing word for any human-animal species hybrid, but instead a generic term for any tribe that lived in the Great Forest. Of the many that originated here, quite a few ended up crossing the sea to the continent over, resulting in them coming to be known as demons. Of the beast folk that stayed, not only did each tribe have an animal-like trait attached to their body, but they also possessed an enhanced version of one of the 5 senses. It was out of all these tribes that only one was tasked with maintaining peace and protecting the sacred beast, the tribe of Doldia and its 2 primary families. With these 2 then splitting into a dozen more branch families, together they made up what was essentially the royal lineage of the entire Great Forest. That's not to say that the beast folk were the only tribes in the area though. Alongside them, there also lived elves and hobbits up to the north, as well as a community of dwarves down south towards the mountains. Contact didn't occur with them very often, but once a year all the tribes would gather to participate in a festival around the sacred tree. It was an event intended to consolidate their peaceful relationship. 2/3 of the way through the rainy season, and that's when we get to the scene with the sacred beast and Laklana. If this made you wonder whether the legendary hero was supposed to be Rudius or not, unfortunately the sacred beast said himself that it wasn't. The calamity wasn't predicted to arrive for another 100 years, and the sacred beast wouldn't even be fully matured until then. So it wouldn't make sense for Rudy to be this legendary hero anyway. Now, 1 month later, and we finally get to the end of the truly uneventful rainy season. other than the whole conflict between Eris and Tona, there wasn't anything else that happened that's really worth mentioning. Even the duel we saw in the anime was just an extra scene that didn't even happen in the novels. Where things start to pick back up again, though, is the whole journey on the Holy Sword Highway to Milis. This was a lengthy road that spanned straight through the Great Forest all the way to the capital. And it was while on this road that Rudius began to learn a little bit more about Geese. An interesting thing to note about his arrival is that neither Ruijerd nor Eris had anything to say about it. Both seemed completely content with having him tag along, which was weird considering Rudius didn't even think that the two of them knew him well. But much to Rudy's surprise, apparently Geese had spent the last 3 months ingratiating himself to them. He had used his smooth talking to become their acquaintances without Rudy even noticing. While normally this wouldn't be that big of a deal, Rudy really wasn't fond of the roundabout way that Geese used to tag along with him. I mean, if he had just asked straight up, then he would have said yes, no problem. But because he went behind his back and did some sneaking around, not only did this make Geese feel much more distanced, but it also gave Rudy the sense that Geese was hiding something. Sure, he wasn't all that bad of a guy, but ever since his fight with Gallus, Rudius couldn't help but feel that there was something darker behind him. It was only after Ruijerd gave his own personal approval that Rudy stopped looking so disgruntled about it. Now, he did make sure to clarify that Geese would be traveling with a Spurd, but that didn't seem to matter since the two had already met before. Yeah, apparently back when Geese was a novice adventurer almost 30 years ago, Ruijerd had saved his life from a monster that was about to kill him. So, even though he knew how scary the Spurds were as a tribe, he also knew that Ruijerd was different among them. For a bit more context about this road, yes, the legend of its creation was absurd, but the fact that no monsters were seen the entire time did add a bit of validity to it. What I mean is that the mana left behind from this sword swing which spanned a continent was more than enough to ward off monsters from the impact zone even centuries after. So, with not a single monster to be seen the entire way, Rudius couldn't fully dismiss the legend as simply that. There was no doubt some strange phenomenon had happened which had caused this road to be made. Setting that aside, there were numerous stations along the road for the four of them to stop and camp at. And this was where Geese would cook some of the greatest meals that Rudius had had in years. When Eris had requested to learn to do the same though, there was actually a pretty significant reason for Geese saying no. You see, back when he was with his old unconventional party of 6, one of the women in it had requested the same thing that Eris did, pretty much for the exact same reasons as well. So, after Geese had agreed and taught her, the woman had actually succeeded in persuading this man to marry her. Geese wasn't sure if the cooking had anything to do with it, but the resulting marriage did end up in the party's 2 core members leaving, eventually leading the rest to go their separate ways as well. This wasn't that big of a deal at the time, but as a man who could do anything except fight or cast magic, there wasn't really much place for him in any other party. So it didn't take long for Geese to realize that the only place he ever truly belonged to was gone now. Thus the reason why he took up gambling and will never teach another woman how to cook again. Now, along their travels, the monument to the 7 great powers was exactly that. It was a symbol of recognition that identified the strongest people in the world as of the end of the Second Great Human-Demon War, a massive conflict that took place over 4,200 years ago. With such a long time having passed since then though, it makes sense then that the list would have been subject to numerous changes, especially given the occurrence of the Laplace War 500 years ago. Because every great power except for the Technique God participated in this war, 3 of them ended up dead, 1 went missing, and another was sealed, leaving only the 2nd-ranked Dragon God as the one to make it out unscathed. So, out of the 4 remaining spots in total, there's 3 that are currently missing and 1 that's sealed away, making the 7 great powers nothing more than a title that's slowly fading from memory. What's interesting about the monument itself is that should the list change in any way at any time, then the monument is set to update automatically via magic. It's essentially a real-time display of the 7 strongest people in the world. Well, according to Geese anyway. It's not something Rudius thought he could personally reach, but he was awestruck by this world's ridiculously wide spectrum of power. Now, after about a month of traveling, that's when the 4 of them finally reached the exit of the forest. 30 days of traveling on this completely straight road had led them to here. The Blue Worm Mountains, where the path continued straight through just like how it did in the forest. But unlike how a forest path is actually easy to make, the fact that this mountain had a clear cut right down the middle just went to reinforce St. Milis' legend even more. Well, that plus a lack of monsters in an area notoriously known to be home to numerous dragons. So St. Milis' divine protection certainly wasn't something to joke about. It was the sole reason they were able to make it through the mountain valley in only 3 days. With that being it for their lengthy journey, we now find ourselves in the holy country of Milis, a beautiful fantasy metropolis that episode 16 brings to life with its amazing visuals. The first thing to note about the city itself are the 7 magic towers that surround its border. Not only do these serve to control the weather of the surrounding area, but they also provide a protective magic barrier that encircles the outskirts, essentially making these 7 pillars the primary line of defense, much like how an outer wall would be. Once you get more into the city, that's where you'll find one of the 4 core districts that make up the interior. To the north is the residential district for both common folk and nobles, the east the commercial district for businesses large and small, the south the adventurers district for all things adventure related, then the west the divine district for anything church related. One key thing to note about the adventurer district is that this is where you'd find the slums. Many failed adventurers would end up living here when they had nowhere else to go, resulting in this being one of the few places where you needed to be a little bit cautious around. So, after choosing an inn that wasn't too close to the slums, Rudius and the others settled in with their usual routine of maintenance and cleaning. Then, after going out for dinner, the trio proceeded with their meeting like how we saw in the anime. While most of this was the same, we did also get an explanation of what Ruijerd was planning for his day off. Apparently he was going to meet up with an old acquaintance, someone he'd met long ago during his lonesome journey wandering the wilderness. Given that he'd been doing so for 500 years, it made sense then that every few decades he'd stumble across the occasional straggler. This one just so happened to be a warrior that lived in Milis. So that's what Ruijerd was doing while Rudius wrote his letter and Eris hunted her goblins. Now, as Rudy was out buying ink and paper, he decided to do a bit of exploration just to see what else the city had to offer. Since he was going to be there at least a month, perhaps he could find a nice couple of spots to take Eris to. But right after he'd started walking down a dingy back alley, that's when he noticed what he assumed were the kidnappers, bringing us to the beginning of this inevitable reunion with Paul. Because Rudy was just out shopping though, both his staff and his robe were still at the inn, so he was neither prepared nor fully equipped for this search and rescue mission. Even so, a staffless Rudy was more than enough to deal with pretty much everyone in the entire building. It also helped that none of his opponents were armed or even very skilled. When none of them showed that they were fast enough to dodge his stone cannon, the fight pretty much devolved into nothing more than easy target practice. At least 10 people were taken out before his next opponents showed up, with one of them being the bikini warrior. Even Rudius couldn't help but find her armor to serve zero practical purpose. He was actually genuinely confused as to why she would even wear it. But when it came to such a revealing outfit, even if it wasn't meant to be an intentional distraction, just her presence was enough to completely remove Rudius's mind from the ongoing battle. If he wanted the fight to become a bit more fair, then he knew that he needed to get her to put some clothes on. So, as he thought about how to do exactly that, it was his memory of an old folktale that helped him to come up with a plan. What the plan consisted of was a 2-step process intended to make the room colder. First, he would cast the AoE magic Icicle Field to drop the temperature by 30 degrees, then he would instantly follow it up with the Wind Magic Blast to ensure that everyone could feel just how cold it was. Sure enough, in only a few seconds of both spells being cast, the woman had already signaled for someone to bring her her overcoat, meaning it was now impossible for her to get the better of him. Before the two could continue their duel though, that's when her boss showed up to take over. A person Rudy could immediately tell was more skilled than any of his other opponents. Just the fact that he was dual-wielding his swords was more than enough to indicate that he was now facing a master swordsman. His stance had also given the impression that he was more than a few leagues above the bikini warrior. Then, as if to prove his speculations correct, this mysterious opponent charged forward the instant he could sense Rudy's hesitation. He then easily blocked all of Rudy's stone cannons through a skillful display of the water god style. But before he could get any closer, Rudy had cast a small shockwave to put some more space between them, leading Paul to make the decision to call for backup. So, unlike how we saw in the anime, Paul's request for help had made this fight a 1v3 instead of a 1v1. The bikini warrior and mage were now moving in an attempt to surround him. So, with Paul to his front and the other two on either side, Rudy was going to need a bit more than just his eye of foresight if he was going to win this. Luckily for him, he did have an extra trick that he'd never used before, something he picked up from his time with the beast folk. The instant Paul made a move to attack, that's when Rudy put forth his best attempt at vocal magic to briefly stop him. It wasn't anywhere near as effective as what we saw from the beast folk, but it was enough to cause Paul to stumble. Now, if you're wondering how this even worked, Well, just because he didn't have the vocal cords of the Doldia didn't mean that he couldn't channel mana into his voice like how they did. It just meant that he couldn't use it at the same level as them. So, what we saw was just enough power to make this drunken Paul fall over himself, giving Rudy the opportunity to take out the mage and bikini warrior. He had first sent a quick offensive spell towards the mage, then dodged the bikini warrior and followed it up with a counterpunch. It wasn't enough force to take her out of the fight, but it was enough to stagger her backwards. It had also gone to enrage Paul straight into his next offensive. Since his line of attack was so predictable though, Rudy was able to trap him in the mud much like how we saw in the anime, not only opening up Paul to a massive attack, but also distracting the bikini warrior long enough for Rudy to knock her out with a stone cannon. So, with things back to a 1v1, that's when we start to converge back with the anime again. Paul had engaged with a four-legged stance unique to the North God style, and his attack was none other than the Sword God style's Long Sword of Silence. It was a deadly combination of techniques that made it clear that Paul was fighting to kill here, a realization Rudy had only come to towards the end of the fight. Had he realized it sooner, then he definitely wouldn't have treated the whole thing in such a casual manner. It just never occurred to him that his opponent was actually trying to kill him. Once it became clear that this was in fact Paul, the two went to the bar in which every person there was a member of Paul's gang. Then, as the conversation got more and more heated, there was that one line about the guards that requires a bit more context. You see, this wasn't just some random insult that Paul had come up with. There was actually a good bit of truth behind it. Reason being that if Rudius had gone to Zandport and spoken to one of the nobles, then it's very likely they would have provided more guards due to the influence of the Grey Rat family. It was an option for more security that Rudy never even came to consider. Of course, his run-in with the Beast Folk didn't give him the opportunity to, but that was a part of the story that Rudius didn't get to yet. So the only way that Paul could see it was that Rudy was being selfish, eventually leading to them getting back into another fight. Unlike in the anime though, Rudy's whirlwind had actually sent him flying all the way behind the bar, which gave Paul the opportunity to get back up and fight again. But with Paul being as drunk as he was, Rudy didn't even need his Eye of Foresight to see where his punches were coming from. It made tossing him to the ground even easier than it was before. So, after Norn stepped in to stop Rudy's bullying, that's when we get to learn a bit more about why Paul's party began to resort to kidnapping. You see, because Milis was a country with a very strict set of slave laws, even if Paul was able to locate a Fatoan and track them down, negotiation with the person owning them would almost always end up with no. No slave owner was ever willing to give up something that was considered their property. So, regardless of whether that slave was once a Fatoan or not, the moment they became a slave was the moment they became their owner's private possession. Those were the laws under which Milis operated. Of course, stealing a slave was certainly a crime as well, but there were also these loopholes that allowed Paul's squad to take the initiative. So, if any former Fatoan wanted to be saved from their current situation, then Paul and his group would do whatever it took to rescue them. There were a couple people who chose to remain, but most were like Somel and ended up in less than ideal situations like prostitution. As a result, many of Paul's group had begun to make enemies of the local nobility. Their increasingly forceful methods of liberation meant that the nobles would have to respond with an equal amount of pressure as well, making each and every day more tense and stressful than the last. Even so, Paul continued to persevere all for the sake of his people. Everything he did, he was doing for them. Now, it's not like Rudius couldn't comprehend where Paul was coming from, but he also truly believed that he did his best. Sure, he didn't have to fool around as much as he did, but every decision he made was the one that felt the most reasonable to him. That's why he just couldn't bring himself to apologize. What was causing him the most pain, though, was the sense of unyielding hostility that was coming from the eyes of his family. Just seeing their gaze the way it was enough to make him feel like a massive piece of his heart was gone. It was an experience that he'd never even encountered before in his past life. Not once did his previous parents ever reject him like the way that Paul just did. So, everything happening to him right now was a brand new trauma unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. One that hurt on a level incomparable to all the others. One of the things that the Mushoku Tensei novels like to do is switch between the perspective of who we're following throughout the story. It's quite often that we're given a break from Rudy and his travels and are instead shown what's happening with some of the different characters. So, when last episode had a major focus on Paul, there was a whole bunch of backstory given which helped to support his own point of view. Stuff that may help you understand why exactly it is he expected so much from Rudy in the first place. So, let's do as we usually do and take a look at what the anime missed from the novels. Let's get started. Episode 17, Reunion. covering chapters 2 to 6 of Volume 5 of the light novel. Starting things off just moments after Paul's teleportation, we find out the place he was sent to was actually somewhat familiar to him. It was a remote area just south of the Asuran Kingdom where he'd once spent a couple years learning the water god style, a place he remembered as Lilia's hometown. This wasn't somewhere he was entirely fond of, but it did bring back all the memories of how his training went. The senior students were a pack of arrogant fools who couldn't even surpass the beginner rank, and the master himself was no more than the advanced level. So, whenever these seniors would try to boss him around for being new, it would always sting since that's the very reason he ran away from home in the first place, especially since he knew he was already a better swordsman than them. When it got to the point where Paul just couldn't put up with it anymore, rather than show them how much better he was with his sword, he instead decided to spite them a different way. You see, the night he ran away, he made sure to sleep with Lilia first. Not because he liked her in any way in particular, but more so because he just wanted to make a mess of something that they treasured. So that's exactly what he ended up doing. Now, once those memories resided, it was the warm touch of Norn that brought him back to reality. She was the sole reason why he could no longer dismiss this as just a dream now. The reason she was even with him at all, though, was simply due to a chance occurrence of him giving her a hug at the time of teleportation. He was just having a casual conversation with Zenith, all while Lilia and Aisha were doing lessons on the other side of the room. Now, Aisha wasn't as gifted as Ridius, but she was definitely growing up much faster than Norn was. Lilia's constant lessons allowed a lot of what she was teaching to just stick, making Paul feel as if there could be something wrong with Norn. Of course, Norn was just a perfectly normal child, but the fact that she was going to grow up in the shadow of two exceedingly bright siblings did make Paul feel a bit bad for her. In any case, what Paul had experienced to get here was something that felt resoundingly similar to a common yet dangerous labyrinth trap. A teleportation trap that instantly transported him and anyone he was in contact with to a different location. Because of the way it split up the party, it was one of the most severe traps that every adventurer knew to look out for. There were countless stories of veteran parties meeting their end because of them. So, with this undoubtedly being some sort of teleportation, the next question to figure out was why. There was certainly no shortage of people who would want to launch a sneak attack on Paul, but teleportation just didn't make sense for one. For starters, there isn't any known incantation for it. In order for teleportation to work, the caster would need to use either a magic circle or a specialized magic item, one of which is forbidden and the other banned. So, for someone to go to such extreme and dangerous lengths just for revenge, well, that definitely wasn't likely. But still, Paul couldn't help but think that perhaps it could be that. Perhaps one of his past acquaintances from training was finally getting back at him. Regardless of what that reason may be, the only thing that mattered now was getting home. A feat that wouldn't have been possible if not for the very cautious nature of Paul as a person. You see, not only did he always carry his sword just in case, but he also kept with it his adventurer card and a single gold coin, specifically for an emergency just like this one. So, after heading into town, he immediately found the guild, split his coin into change, then finessed himself a horse through quite the ingenious method. Something that was only possible due to two very important factors. Because Paul was a registered S-rank adventurer, that meant that he was eligible for special S-rank privileges, one of which was the provision of a horse whenever an urgent delivery job was taken. While normally this would be a quest reserved for those of the E rank or lower, the urgent aspect of it meant that anyone could take it. So Paul accepted this quest just so he could gain access to the horse that came with it. Of course, the guild was expecting the horse back upon the job's completion, but Paul never intended to complete the job in the first place. If it meant that he was able to get home faster, then he was willing to accept any punishment the guild would give him after the fact. Now, the reason Norn had gotten sick was mainly due to the fact that Paul rarely ever stopped. Regardless of whether it was day or night, Paul made sure to keep moving forward through all of it. It was a strenuous expedition that Norn simply couldn't keep up with, resulting in her getting sick right in the middle of it. Since that forced Paul to stop to nurse her back to health, the entire journey ended up taking 2 months in total. So, despite him trying to get back home as fast as possible, the time it took to help Norn meant that he might as well have taken a carriage right from the get-go. At least that way Norn wouldn't have gotten sick. But anyway, once Paul had come to see the true gravity of the entire situation, that's when he began to fear for the safety of his family. Zenith could probably handle herself since she was a former adventurer, but Aisha and Lilia were completely different. Yes, Lilia did know how to use a sword, but ever since the incident with the poison, she wasn't quite as good as she used to be. Plus, unless Lilia was holding Aisha at the time of teleportation, then there was no way to know for sure if the two were even teleported together. So, Paul could only hope that the two were at least holding hands. Switching back to his arrival at Fatoa, the person we see here was actually a butler of Philip's, a loyal servant to the Boreas Grey Rat family, as well as the sole person responsible for setting up this entire refugee camp. The reason he'd approached Paul at all was mainly to see if he could help in supporting the refugees. You see, despite being completely aware of Paul's less than ideal traits, he was also aware that Paul was extremely reliable in times of crisis. Combine this with the fact that he was the man who raised Rudy, and that was enough for Alphonse to believe that he could trust him. Apparently, Rudy had said quite a few good things about Paul during his time at the mansion. So, with the help of Alphonse's numerous connections, Paul was able to set up a fully functional refugee camp complete with several workers and a rescue squad. They then set out to the country of Millicent and began to scout the entire continent. While the first 6 months were rather productive, Paul never was able to achieve his primary objective of finding his own family. But what we didn't get to see in the anime was how he was able to use his relation to Zenith as an advantage. You see, Zenith just so happened to come from a noble house with quite a bit of influence in Millis. They were a family well known for producing famous knights amongst other things. So, with ties to noble lineage, Paul was able to use that to start freeing many of the slaves that he found. Any slave that couldn't be bought with goods or gold was instead pressured by Zenith's family to consider otherwise. If there came a time when that didn't work though, that's when Paul and his crew would be forced to resort to kidnapping, resulting in many of the other nobles starting to send their own forces after him. Even so, both this connection to nobility and his status as an adventurer still wasn't enough to locate the people that he really wanted. Then, by the time a year had passed, most stranded Fatoans in Millis had been located and were actively being freed if they were stuck in slavery. There was still the occasional person who would be found in a remote village far from the main city, but most news was now about dead Fatoans rather than live ones. So it seemed as if Paul's operation was getting close to its end now. They did manage to save several thousand refugees, but that still didn't make up for those he couldn't find and those who were already lost. Combine that with several people who blame him for taking too long to find their family, and the end result is the Paul that we see in the anime. After another 6 months, the whole operation was now shifting from search and rescue to escort missions. With very little Fatoans left to be found, many of Paul's group were better used to escort the women, children, and elderly back to the Asura Kingdom. The search and rescue squad was still kept active, but the entire thing was planned to end in only another 6 months. 2 years was the longest that anyone was willing to keep funding them. Not only was it far too expensive to keep it going, but the amount of planning and logistics needed to comb the countryside simply wasn't achievable with their current group of people, especially with Paul being in the state that he was in now. With that being everything that happened to Paul, we can now move on to his post-fight conversation with Geese. As we know from last episode, Geese was a former member of the Black Wolf Fangs who was kind of discreetly helping him. He did get in touch with Paul prior to leaving for Zantport, but he never did confirm that he was going to search for his family. All they did was have a few brief conversations before Geese just randomly disappearing one day. So, for him to show up now almost 1 year later, well, that was quite the shock considering his abrupt departure last time. Now, when we get to their conversation, most of it was pretty much the same, but there was a bit more that can be shown from Paul's perspective. You see, one of the main reasons why Paul felt he could expect so much from Rudy was partly because of the fight they'd just had yesterday. Yes, Paul was a little drunk during the encounter, but he couldn't deny that he was going all out the entire time. So, the fact that he was only able to slice the panties off of Rudy's face was more than enough proof to indicate that Rudy was now stronger than he was. Not only did he remain untouched the entire fight, but it was clear that he wasn't even trying like how all the others were. That much was obvious when he found out none of his people suffered more than minor injuries. So, with Paul seeing Rudy as both smarter and stronger than him now, he couldn't help but feel like there was nothing wrong in expecting more out of him. To him, age was irrelevant when it came to a person's capabilities. Now, another factor that helped to influence this mindset was a message from Ghislaine herself that stated that she didn't even think that she could beat Rudeus. You see, back when she saw him fend off those kidnappers in episode 5, Ghislaine believed that if Rudy was given enough range, then there was no way she'd ever be able to safely close the gap on him. So, if the Sword King Ghislaine wasn't able to beat Rudeus given the right conditions, then that meant there were likely less than 1,000 people worldwide who could do it either. It was yet another aspect of Rudy that Paul thought made up for his lack of real-world experience. Besides, when talking about the realm of prodigies, you have people like the second North God who was able to beat a Sword Emperor during his first fight. That being the case, Paul truly didn't believe that he was expecting too much, especially since Rudy also had a spurt protecting him. What Paul failed to see about this spurt factor, though, was the arduous circumstances under which it happened. I mean, it's not like Rudy automatically knew exactly what Ruijerd wanted right from the get-go. He was, after all, just a stranger. So, when encountered with a powerful person whose intentions are vague at best, what better option to choose than to get on their good side? This was what Geese was trying to explain. Rudy helping Ruijerd was the safest path he could have chosen. Not only did it guarantee his safety throughout the Demon Continent, but it also gave him the opportunity to learn new skills from a very powerful instructor. There was no benefit in risking anything else, and that was the aspect of the spurt factor that Paul was failing to consider. Now, if Rudy was able to comb the continent along with everything else that he did, then Geese straight up said that he was ready to give the kid a spot in the 7 Great Powers. That may have been a joke to Geese, but Paul truly felt that Rudy had the raw talent to make it there. And that wasn't just his parental pride speaking. In any case, when the picture was painted like that, that's when Paul finally started to reconsider things. What really got him going, though, was the whole explanation of why Rudy didn't see his message in the first place. It's not like Geese knew all the details himself, but he was able to explain what had happened during his time with the Dodia tribe. So eventually Paul was able to conclude that something had happened before Rudy could even get to Zandport, something that resulted in him getting taken prisoner by the Dodia. As for how Geese was able to find Rudy, well, he had actually been scouring the Great Forest for any lost humans when he had come across some information that one was locked up by the Dodia. Then, by using his connection with the local warriors, he was able to get himself tossed into the same jail cell as them, the plan being to help the kid escape and make it back to Millis. Of course, Geese was expecting to find a sobbing snot-nosed brat, but instead what he found was infinitely better. A couple interactions was all it took for Geese to realize that this was Paul's kid. His casual demeanor and absolute confidence was more than enough proof to indicate it. While Paul was shocked to hear how the two had met, what he really wanted to know was why Geese just didn't explain everything to Rudius while he was there. A question Geese quickly avoided by switching the topic then leaving, bringing us back to what we saw in the anime. It was shortly after this conversation, though, that Vieira had showed up in an outfit much less provocative than her normal one, reason being that she currently felt like what had happened may have been her fault. She couldn't help but think that perhaps her outfit may have caused Rudy to misunderstand the nature of their relationship. So, with this being the topic of conversation, that's when we get to learn why it is Vieira wears such revealing armor in the first place. You see, back when the displacement incident had happened, Vieira was captured by a gang of bandits who then treated her as a plaything. Even with having some skills as an adventurer, her lack of equipment meant she simply couldn't defend herself. So it was a hellish nightmare that you'd expect to leave trauma on anyone. But much to Paul's surprise, the time it took for her to bounce back after being rescued was surprisingly fast. Vieira was somehow able to put these unspeakable events behind her. Unfortunately for her sister Shiera, though, she didn't seem to have the willpower to do the same. Because she too went through a similar situation, just the eye contact of a man was enough to make her tremble uncontrollably. So, in order to protect her sister from any unwanted attention, Vieira started to wear this skimpy armor to focus all that attention on her. Not only protecting her sister from her past trauma, but also every other woman who was subjected to the same. She was truly an indispensable part of Paul's team. Now, it was after this that pretty much everything else was identical to the novels. Rudy and Paul were able to make up, then the group spent a week doing things around the city. Quick heads up, it looks like I missed making videos for episodes 18, 19, and 20, so unfortunately we're gonna have to skip to episode 21 here. I know that kinda sucks with the consistency, but I promise for season 2 it'll cover all of it. But yeah, I'm really sorry that I never got around to making these. Episode 21, Turning Point 2, covering chapters 8 to 10 of volume 6 of the light novel. Where we start off at the beginning of the episode is the long path between the Shirane Kingdom and the Asura Kingdom, the last stretch of mountain before Rudy could finally arrive back home. There was the occasional bandit every so often, but compared to the monsters of the Demon Continent, these bandits were a cakewalk. It was nothing more than a chore for Eris to send them packing. As for why bandits were so common here in contrast to everywhere else, well, that was mainly due to the peaceful nature of the region itself. The lack of monsters made it easy for bandits to lay ambushes pretty much anywhere. Plus, with the number of smaller countries currently fighting up north, it was likely that this was causing an increase to their number as well. Now, the exact location where we are in the anime is a continent-wide mountain range known as the Redworm Mountains, the home to the central continent's strongest monster. While one was certainly enough to be a challenge for Ruijerd, what made them especially fearsome was their detection ability. No matter how small a person or creature was, if it made the mistake of trespassing into their territory, then these dragons would immediately know and swarm together to devour it. That was one of the most common facts behind them. Some other miscellaneous facts include their ranking as the strongest species of dragon, as well as their vast territory and herd mentality. That being the case, it was only natural for the Redworm Mountains to become known as this impassable mountain range, a place synonymous with death for anyone unlucky enough to traverse there. For all their power and ferocity though, the Red Worms did actually have one single weakness, and that was that their ability to fly wasn't very refined. Yes, they could maneuver themselves well enough while in the air, but it was getting into the air that was the hard part. You see, in order for a worm to be able to take flight, they would have to either jump off a cliff or run down a lengthy slope. Simply flapping their wings just wasn't enough to lift them. That's why you'd never find this species of dragon in the plains or forests. Of course, there was the occasional worm who'd fall from the skies and start wandering the plains, but that was a rare occurrence typically handled by adventurers. It was an S-rank extermination mission that required a party of at least 10. A single dragon was just that tough to handle. What made it quite the coveted quest though was the generous reward of 100 gold for completing it. That alone was enough for all 10 members to live lavishly for at least a year. So it was actually quite common for underranked adventurers to try and fail at completing it. Now, in order to traverse these mountains, there were actually 2 passages through which travelers could cross relatively safely. Small gorges known as the Redworm's lower jaw and upper jaw. Since the lower jaw was the path that connected the south to the west, that's the route that Rudius was heading. It was getting there that required quite the lengthy detour though. They could just have cut straight through the mountains like how Eris wanted, but that was an endeavor that even Ruijerd couldn't handle. You see, Eris had a slightly warped perception of just how strong these dragons were. Because Ghislaine had once told her of the time that she'd slain one, Eris now believed that she could too. Well, her together with Rudius and Ruijerd. What Eris was failing to consider about this story though was the fact that Ghislaine was with a party of 5, the dragon they were fighting was a grounded straggler separated from its pack, and still 2 of her members ended up dying anyway. So, if just one grounded worm was enough to take on Ghislaine and a party of advanced level swordsmen, then a whole flying swarm was definitely more than enough for their party. It was an endeavor that we now know even some of the current 7 great powers would find difficult. That's not to say that the current 7 great powers are weak, but if you go back in time to when the list had people like Laplace in it, then even the lowest rank power could pass through Red Worm territory peacefully. That's just how much more powerful the 7 great powers of old were. If you're wondering just how much more powerful, well, Laplace did manage to subjugate the king of the Red Worms, so you can probably imagine the level of power that would be needed to do something like that. In any case, it was as Eris and Ruijerd were doing their sparring that Rudius was contemplating the actions of the man god. After careful consideration of all his advice and the events to ensue after, Rudius began to think that perhaps this man god was more trustworthy than he was giving him credit for. You see, the more Rudius considered each situation, the more he started to realize that the man god's advice ensured things would turn out the same way no matter what he did. Whether it was his chance meetings with Aisha and Kashirika, getting saved by Zenoba or Ruijerd, or even just getting captured by the Doldia, all those were positive events that seemed immutable. So perhaps that meant that Rudius could trust him after all. If that was ever going to happen though, Rudius first wanted Hitogami to be a bit more honest with him. He didn't like how this man god's motives were always shrouded by mystery. Switching back to Eris's training now. In the year that passed since their last fight in the Demon Continent, Rudius was no longer confident that he could beat Eris anymore. Sure, he could easily win if he used magic and had a little bit of distance to start, but if he could only use his demon eye like how it was in episode 12, then Rudius now felt that it was impossible. Her skills in combat now surpassed anything that Rudius's demon eye could possibly compensate for. As for the reason why Ruijerd decided to declare her a warrior, well, that was partly because of Rudius. You see, no matter how much time had passed and how much Eris matured, Ruijerd had noticed that Rudius would still treat her like a child. This wasn't something that Rudy saw any particular problem with, but clearly that wasn't the case for Ruijerd. So, as a means of trying to get Rudius to understand, Ruijerd took the initial step to help him get there. It was an unusual gesture that made Rudius feel as if this was some sort of death flag. That being the case, right before the two were about to go to sleep, Rudius made sure to give Ruijerd a good luck charm first, a gold coin for him to keep close for the rest of their travels. Now, it was 4 months after the events in the Shirone Kingdom that Rudius and the others would finally reach the Lower Jaw, the fateful passage in which the group would encounter their toughest obstacle yet. So, as the three of them were riding their carriage down this path, what brought them to a halt was a simple question from the man who would later introduce himself as Orsted, a strange person who both Eris and Ruijerd seemed to be utterly fearful of. While Rudius saw him as just a person with intimidating eyes though, it was actually the young girl beside him that he was most interested by. Something about her ashen brown hair and pure white mask just made her image extremely easy to remember. Before he could inspect these two any further though, the countless splinters of Orsted's image went to make the whole thing even more strange. Then, the more questions Orsted began to ask about who they were, the more Rudius began to get the feeling that perhaps this man was friendly. There was something about the way he talked that just made him seem satisfied, almost like he was happy to be reuniting with some old friends from the past. Of course, neither Ruijerd nor Eris knew who he was, but that didn't stop Orsted from expressing his content in seeing them alive and well. That said, because the two weren't showing any change in their hostile demeanor, Orsted simply decided to leave them be. It was as he was turning to leave, though, that Orsted would part with a couple more interesting lines. In addition to saying that he'd stay out of their way, he also went on to mention that they'd eventually come to know him. A statement spoken with such utter confidence that it was almost like it was implying that this was some sort of inevitable truth. It was for this very reason that Rudius's intuition began to tell him that Orsted knew something that the others didn't. Something that only an existence akin to the man god would know. That was the vibe that Rudius was currently getting from him. So, with a sudden urge to figure out what this man knew, Rudius turned and made the biggest mistake of his life. He called out and began the conversation we see in the anime. Had Rudius not done this, then Orsted wouldn't have contemplated why he had no memory of ever meeting him, and he also wouldn't have noticed the lack of fear from him either. Two key clues that went to indicate that perhaps this strange child could be affiliated with the man god. That being the case, the nonchalant manner that Orsted previously held with Ruijerd and Eris had now switched to a more cautious and distant one, leading Orsted to ask the final question which would seal Rudius's fate. Now, the reason why Rudius responded in such a prompt manner was partly because he let his guard down thinking the conversation was over, but mostly because this was the only sense that Orsted had made the entire time. You see, because the man god was something that Rudius had never talked about, the sudden mention of his name from such a confusing character had made Rudy impulsively want to continue the conversation. He instinctively felt like this was some knowledge that they could both share together. So, out of a pure natural reaction, Rudy would speak the words that would spur Orsted into action, leading to the incredible display of combat we saw in the anime. If we start from the very beginning, the initial fight between Ruijerd and Orsted was so one-sided that the entire thing didn't even last for more than 10 seconds. It's not like Orsted was that much faster, but it was the way he moved that just made it seem that way. With every motion Ruijerd would make, Orsted would make a slightly better one to give him the advantage. It was a constant cycle in which the longer it went, the worse it would become for Ruijerd and the closer Orsted would be to completing his trap. So, as Ruijerd's balance worsened and his attacks slowed, the massive gap in experience became all the more apparent. Everything about Orsted's strategy just seemed perfect, much to the point that if there was an optimal approach to combat, then this would be a prime example of it. His movements were minimal yet effective, his positioning invited the exact attacks that he wanted, then his counters led Ruijerd right to the moment that he had planned for. It was a fight that was over before it had even begun. There were no options left for Ruijerd other than to fall for the trap that Orsted had laid for him. When Eris had charged in to fight Orsted next, what's important to note is the technique that he had used to stop her. This was the defensive water god technique called Flow, a more polished version of the one that Paul had once used on Rudius. By gently redirecting Eris's sword with the palm of his hand, Orsted was able to send Eris flying. It was a single fluid motion that highlighted every aspect of the water god style's value. Now, when we see Rudius pat down every part of his body next, this was actually due to the vision from his demon eye. He had just foreseen his lungs, heart, throat, and head all get crushed. A vivid scene that he could only compare to a fatality from a fighting game. So, as he checked to see if all were still there, Orsted's first attack went straight for the lungs. You see, because he knew that Rudius was some sort of magician, Orsted had opted to eliminate any chance of retaliation by collapsing his lungs. An impact that not only fractured 6 of his ribs, but also guaranteed Rudius's death since he couldn't cast healing magic anymore. But rather than simply lay over and die, Rudius instead kept thinking on how to fight back. His only thought was of how if he was to die here, then Orsted would surely go back and finish off the other 2. So, what we saw first was the use of the fastest stone cannon that Rudius could conjure, followed by the most explosive fireball that he could imagine. On his initial attempt at casting it though, Orsted had used his Disturb magic to interrupt it. By aiming his right hand towards the source of Rudius's mana, he had managed to effectively seal away Rudius's ability to gather any. Well, the ability to gather any with his right hand anyway. Since this Disturb magic seemed to only work on a single target location, that meant that Rudius could still make use of his left hand. An option that Orsted didn't even try to consider since the ability to simultaneously use multiple different schools of magic was somewhat unknown to him, especially when it came to casting them without an incantation. So, when Orsted tried to imitate it himself, although he did do it successfully on his first try, he did also mention how it was more difficult than he expected. Rudius's unique approach to spellcasting had actually gone to impress him. Now, on the second attempt at this fireball, what Rudius had gone to imagine was something akin to a nuke. His mind was already so far gone that he didn't even consider the possibility of Eris and Ruijerd getting caught up in it. All his focus was simply centered on this one final attack, an enormous ball of flame that was supposed to leave behind a mushroom cloud. What's interesting to note after though is that even after Orsted had blocked this massive attack, he was still very cautious over what Rudius's next move could be. Just the fact that he hadn't yet healed his lungs only went to make Orsted think that perhaps Rudius was trying to get him to lower his guard. He truly believed that there was something more to this so-called apostle. It was the instant their eyes had met though that Orsted finally understood Rudius was only skilled at magic. Whatever more he was expecting from this disciple of Hitogami certainly wasn't going to be seen from Rudius. He wasn't even capable of coding himself in battle aura. So, when all was said and done, Orsted was actually left feeling quite a bit disappointed. He just couldn't understand why the man god would bother with a pawn who was so apparently weak. In any case, the only other line that we missed from the rest of the encounter was a single heavy statement directed from Orsted to Eris. After seeing just how important Rudius was to her, not only did Orsted apologize for doing what he did, but he also made sure to say that she'd understand why one day, almost as if to imply that this was a necessary and unavoidable outcome. But yeah, that was the whole conflict as it happened in the novels. When we get to the conversation with Hitogami after, there wasn't much we missed out on other than a small discussion regarding Orsted's curses. You see, Rudius had actually begun to sympathize with him. As someone who knew what it was like to be hated by everyone around him, Rudius understood why Orsted would become this existence that wants to destroy the world. Now, that's not to say that this is his actual motive, but Hitogami does identify this as Orsted's objective. It was something that Rudius could personally understand since his past life had led him to that exact same way of thinking. Now, aside from that, the last thing worth mentioning is the significance of the girl with Orsted. There was something about her that Rudius just found familiar. He wasn't sure where he'd heard her name before, but what he was sure of was the fact that he'd heard of it at least once before. Sometime in the past year, Rudius was certain that he'd heard it mentioned. He just couldn't remember exactly where or when. Episode 22, Dreams and Reality, covering the last 2 chapters of Volume 6 of the light novel. 3 days after the events with Orsted, and the 3 of them had finally made it back to the Asura Kingdom. The remaining journey wasn't necessarily different from how it was before, but things did seem a little bit gloomy. Well, that and Eris seemed to treat Rudius slightly different now. You see, not only did she start staying much closer to Rudius' side, but she also became much more passive with regards to his antics. Things that she would normally end up punching Rudius for were no longer met by a fist but instead a glare. Then, unlike how she would normally just leave him alone after, no matter what weird thing Rudius seemed to do, Eris just kept herself close. It was getting to the point where if Rudius' hands were left completely free, then it was only a matter of time before they ended up in Eris' direction. So, part of the reason we see Rudius practicing his Disturb magic was actually because this was to help him keep his hands off of her. As for the way this magic worked, well, the concept was simple but implementation difficult. Any source of mana from which magic was being cast could simply be targeted and disrupted by a different kind of mana. It was a method of nullification very similar to the King Tier barrier in the Shirane Kingdom. What made using it so extremely difficult, though, was the seemingly countless rules that came with applying it. Sure, Rudius could partially disrupt the formation of his own stone cannon, but that still didn't completely stop the spell as a whole. At best, he could only apply an imperfect restraint, not an absolute nullification like how Orsted did. If Rudius could figure out the extent of these rules, though, then he was certain a whole new world of possibilities would open up for him. Perhaps he could figure out a way to prevent having his magic sealed again, or maybe even create a spell that could negate Orsted's disturbed magic. Whatever it was, Eris was in awe over just how amazing it was, much to the point that she felt the need to ask why Rudius was so strong. This wasn't really a question that Rudius could answer, but he did understand that the cause of it was her previous encounter with Orsted. I mean, being defeated by a single attack certainly wasn't good for her confidence, so it only made sense that she now felt inferior. Of course, no one could blame her for losing to the Dragon God, but that wasn't an aspect Eris was even considering. All she could focus on was how she failed. It was the complete opposite mindset of what Rudius had, a mindset that she simply couldn't understand. Now, that's not to say Rudius was treating his almost fatal encounter lightly, but it was the surreal nature of it that made him understand just how outclassed he was. He was now well aware of exactly how high this world's ceiling of power went. So if him and Eris were going to survive their next encounter with a person like Orsted, then Rudius knew the two of them would need to get stronger. Not strong enough per se to defeat that person in a fight, but just strong enough for them to be able to escape together. That was the lesson that Rudius had learned from this. His focus was now centered on survival over anything else, all because he didn't want to almost die next time. It was after Rudius had told Eris this that he also went on to say how he was going to work hard for her. If there ever did come a time where an opponent was too much for them to handle, then Rudius said he'd be strong enough to pick her up and make a run for it. It was a statement that had left Eris with quite a bit to think about. Moving on to Ruijerd's conversation with Rudius, the first thing they had talked about was actually Orsted. According to Ruijerd, this was the first person since Laplace in which, with only a single glance, he could clearly see just how outmatched he was. There was a bloodthirsty aura that emanated from his entire body, something that made Ruijerd know he simply couldn't win against him. That didn't make his defeat any less regrettable, but he did understand just how lucky they were to survive. That's why we see a certain disappointment in Ruijerd's demeanor here. He was actually upset that Rudius had tried to interact with a person everyone else was so very cautious of. That being the case, Ruijerd made sure to stress that if that situation was to ever happen again, then avoiding all contact was an absolute necessity. It was the most important lesson that Rudius needed to take away from this. As the two went on to discuss the topic of the man god and curses next, we actually find out that curses are permanent. You see, when it comes to a person that's been born with one, there's zero conceivable methods of getting rid of it. That's why people like Orsted are cursed to bear theirs forever. What makes Ruijerd's fundamentally different, though, is that his wasn't one that he was born with. The fact that his was transferred instead of being innate makes it a bit more believable that it could actually be fading. So, despite this notion coming from someone as shady as the man god, it was still something that Ruijerd could find solace in. Rudius just made sure to add that it should be considered with a grain of salt. Now, 1 month later, and the three had finally arrived at the Fatoa region. They were right outside the entrance to the refugee camp when Ruijerd abruptly declared that his duty was over now. As much as Rudius wanted him to stay, he wasn't so sure that Ruijerd would even want to. He couldn't help but feel that he himself was much more of a burden than Ruijerd was willing to put up with. So, as Rudius went on to say how they wouldn't have made it without him, Ruijerd then went to proclaim otherwise. Yes, Rudius did make his fair share of mistakes along the way, but so long as he was able to recognize that that's what they were, then Ruijerd was confident that he'd be just fine. Especially since he'd been able to demonstrate the whole great power, great responsibility type thing. You see, one of the things that Ruijerd found the most impressive was that despite Rudius possessing this great talent which placed him on a pedestal, not once did he ever let it get to his head. That was the key thing that allowed Ruijerd to accept Rudius as a warrior now. It was even after he had heard all that, though, that Rudius still wanted to list out all his other weaknesses. To him, there were just so many other things that made him feel the opposite. But even he was self-aware enough to know just how pathetic that would be. So, rather than grovel in his own weakness, Rudius instead chose to stand with his head held high, only lowering it to bow as a sign of gratitude. It was as he was starting the motion, though, that Ruijerd quickly moved to stop him. There was no need for Rudius to show his gratitude since Ruijerd believed that Rudius had done enough in exchange already, bringing us to the start of their conversation in the anime. Most of it was pretty much the same, but the one thing that we did miss out on was what Ruijerd was planning to do after. Apparently he was going to look for any remnants of the Spurred in the central continent. Restoring the honor of his tribe wasn't something he felt he could do alone. Then, if he did happen to have some free time, then he also said how he would try and look for Zenith. That was the path that Ruijerd was going to walk now. Moving on to Eris's abrupt return to reality, there's a bit more context that needs to be given behind the deaths of Philip and Hilda. You see, despite the two not being teleported very far, they were unfortunately displaced to an area known as the Conflict Zone, a convoluted region located to the east of the mountains where numerous smaller nations were constantly at war for control over the territory there. So, for nobles like Philip and Hilda to end up there, well, that was pretty much a death sentence for them. Unless they had managed to meet up with Ghislaine immediately after teleporting, then there was very little chance for the two of them to make it out of there. Now, not much is said about how they died, but the lack of words from Ghislaine was enough to indicate that it wasn't pretty. The manga does hint at what could have happened, but the true fate of Philip and Hilda was never actually described to us. Instead, we're meant to decide for ourselves based on Ghislaine's frustrated demeanor. Because her expression was so clearly filled with remorse and resent, it was more than enough to fill Rudius's head with all sorts of unpleasant assumptions, something the anime unfortunately doesn't quite show us. When it came to the topic of Saros next, despite Rudius letting his emotions get the best of him, he did also understand why some would see his execution as necessary. He understood that the people needed someone to blame. So, if the kingdom wanted to soothe the people's discontent, then executing Saros was certainly the best way to do exactly that. It was the same idea as the Japanese Prime Minister resigning when something shameful happened. Of course, Rudius was also certain there was some sort of power struggle, but the extent to which it was involved was something he couldn't even begin to imagine. The lack of any sort of attempt at re-establishment was all Rudius needed to see to know that the kingdom didn't really care about the incident. It was quite obvious that politics was more important than the people. What went to bug Rudius the most, though, once Rudius had put Lilia and Aisha onto the list of survivors, there was an entire scene after that didn't make it into the anime. A private discussion between Alphonse, Ghislaine, and Rudius, basically discussing the full extent of Eris's 3-year journey. It was after that story was given, though, that we then get to a far more important discussion. One that starts off with Alphonse saying how they were the only 3 remaining. Of all the people who had once served Lord Saros, it was him, Rudius, and Ghislaine that was all that was left. This was a bit surprising considering how many maids Lord Saros had, but it was likely that any beast folk formerly employed under his name was either dead or back in their homeland. So, given that this was the dire state of the Boreas Grey Rat family, Alphonse decided it was best to start building it up again. And his first step to doing so was to make Rudius a vassal of it. His achievements and wit showed he was more than mature enough to take on the position. It was also the only way Rudius could take part in the ensuing conversation about Eris's future. The first thing that we learned from this rather crucial exchange was that Eris did actually have some family remaining. Lord James, who was the current liege lord of the area, was supposedly already sheltering Eris's brothers and cousins. So this would have been a great potential place for Eris to stay, had James not already implied that he didn't want her to. Because Eris wasn't the ladylike noble that everyone expected her to be, it was unlikely that any noble who cared about their image would take her. They just couldn't view her as one of them. That being the case, the only other option was then Pilimon. As Paul's younger brother and the current head of the Natos household, he was the only noble willing to take her. What made even Alphonse hesitant to take this offer, though, was the troubling rumors of Philemon trying to gain favor with High Minister Darius. You see, Darius wasn't quite the upstanding individual. Despite his rapid increase in political power, it was his schemes that had driven the second princess out of the country, a person who Philemon was once a massive supporter of. As soon as that princess was out of the picture, though, Philemon had quickly started to make moves to the winning side, one of which is the scheme we see here to make Eris his concubine. Now, just like Rudius, you're probably wondering how exactly that would gain favor with High Minister Darius. Well, to explain that, we actually have to go back to episode 5, back to the night when Eris and Rudius were kidnapped. This may come as a bit of a surprise, but Darius was the one who had orchestrated it. On his single and only visit to the Fatoa region, one glance was all it took for Darius to develop a perversion towards Eris, leading him to go so far as to try and kidnap her. It didn't take long for Saros to find out that he was the culprit, but Darius's influence made him practically untouchable. There wasn't anything Saros could do to retaliate, so instead the whole thing was just swept under the rug. But now that you know that this was what had happened, I'm sure you've pieced together exactly why Philemon wants Eris now. It's more than likely that the moment he gets his hands on Eris, he'll immediately go and try to send her off to Darius, leaving Eris to a horrible life with a perverted noble. Unlike how Rudius completely rejected the idea though, Alphonse was only looking at the bigger picture. Yes, Eris would have to put up with a filthy man of a husband, but her newfound power would place her in a position to help restore the Fatoa region. Like, if she went and made a request to develop a new village in Fatoa, then Alphonse was positive Darius would see to it. That was the value that came with this proposal. It was the most beneficial for the people the Boreas Grey Rats were once responsible for. When Rudius went to ask Elaine what she thought next, he was actually surprised to hear her say that Eris should be with him. Then even more so when Alphonse didn't completely disagree with it. You see, Philemon wasn't Eris's only path to nobility. There was actually one more that came in the form of Rudius. Since Paul had accomplished so much good during the whole displacement incident, the initial steps for Rudius to gain influence were already laid out for him. The only problem was getting the Liege Lord James to allow it. Ghislaine did also recommend to just run away, but that was an option Alphonse simply couldn't accept. He refused to leave the people of Fatoa to suffer. So, if that meant that he had to offer up Eris, then that was a sacrifice he was willing to make. Which finally brings us to this divisive moment that we saw in the anime. Now, while Rudius did understand where both sides were coming from, at the end of the day it didn't really matter. The decision on what Eris was going to do was ultimately going to be decided by Eris herself. No one else had any right to tell her otherwise. So, with that bringing this meeting of vassals to its end, the next scene is the one I'm sure a lot of you weren't quite expecting. It was a very delicate moment that needed to be treated very carefully. Not just because of the act that was being portrayed, but also because of the emotions that needed to be portrayed with it. The scene needed to be able to show both Eris and Rudius' state of mind. So, for them to be able to do just that with the very little dialogue given, well, that just goes to show how masterful the direction was. What I will add to give a bit more context though is that while Rudius did think he loved her and did think he wanted to start a family, he never once stopped to consider how Eris felt. He would spend the whole night thinking about what their future together would be like, but never once consider how he would help her get through the present. It didn't cross his mind to wonder at all what Eris was thinking. Not very many shows can wrap things up like the way that Mushoku Tensei just did. I mean, yes, we did get the expected cliffhanger of an ending, but that wasn't what I found myself thinking about when the episode had ended. No. Instead, I was more so captivated by just how well the anime managed to highlight Rudius' growth. The way they combined the memories of his past life together with scenes of the people he's helped in this new one really hammers home just how far he's come. It was a spectacular way of reminding us of everything that's happened this season, ultimately concluding with Rudius choosing to take another step forward. Now, because most of this was original to the anime, we were unfortunately shown less of Eris, specifically the parts explaining why she decided to leave Rudius. So that's exactly what we're going to look at here. Let's get started. Episode 23, Wake Up and One Step Forward, covering the last few chapters of Volume 6 of the light novel as well as a couple extra chapters from Volume 1 and Volume 7. The reason why this is because the anime had taken quite the interesting approach to presenting a finale of sorts. You see, rather than simply leave us with the cliffhanger of Rudeus' uncertain path towards Zenith, they instead decided to put a heavy focus on showing how he reached that conclusion. The whole flashback regarding his past life in Japan, all the way to the memory of his early years with his mother, were all events not intended to be shown here. So, for them to incorporate both anime original aspects as well as scenes that had taken place all the way back in Volume 1, well, that was actually pretty clever. What the anime had to leave out in exchange for that, though, was a much more detailed explanation as to why Eris decided to leave Rudeus. A different perspective that highlights a cascading chain of events starting all the way back in Episode 8. On the night of Rudeus' 10th birthday, it was actually Eris' mother who had made it clear what she needed to do for him. It wasn't something Eris was necessarily against, but it also wasn't something she wanted to force either. So, when the thought of her just being a reward had come to her mind, it made her think that perhaps Rudeus didn't like her the way that she did him. Perhaps he was just accepting her since her father had told him to, an assumption that would inevitably lead her to reject him. It was the moment she had left his room, though, that a whole swirl of regret began churning up from deep inside her. She began to feel as if she'd made a terrible mistake, one that may have ruined her relationship with Rudy forever. So, out of the fear of having potentially closed that door for good, Eris turned back to try and fix it. You see, even if she was only being seen as a reward, to her it didn't matter if it meant she could be together with Rudeus. As soon as she got back to his room, though, she was thoroughly shocked to see that Rudeus was the one apologizing. Clearly, things weren't as bad as she thought they were. And though she couldn't fully understand what exactly was going on, what she did understand was that this was where she had started to fall for him. Fast forward to the first few months after the teleportation incident, and what we have is a Rudeus whose demeanor has noticeably shifted, along with an Eris who is struggling to keep up with it. The devious and playful Rudeus who Eris was always dealing with back home had now changed into this massive pillar of support for her. He would never make any inappropriate moves, nor would he show any of his own suffering. He would simply stay beside her and comfort her whenever it was needed. While this did work to keep her calm, it was eventually becoming more and more evident that Rudeus was struggling too. He was just keeping it hidden so as to not make her worry about him. So, with Rudeus trying so hard for her sake, Eris wanted nothing more than to do the same for him. She wanted to get stronger so as to not be a burden for him. But because all she could do was wield a sword, there wasn't much place to help out since, well, they had Ruijerd. Even so, Eris still committed herself to training. The fear of Rudeus eventually leaving her behind, combined with the feeling of being the weakest link in the party, drove her to do whatever was needed to change that. Day after day would be spent getting knocked down by Ruijerd just so that a little of what he was showing her could eventually be made her own. Then, after a year of slowly soaking it all in, Eris would finally land a hit on him. It was an amazing achievement that made her think she'd finally become strong, leading her to believe that she could walk alongside Rudeus, not as a hindrance but as an equal now. Just as quickly as that confidence had come, though, it was all but completely shattered after her utter defeat a few days later. The whole year she'd spent improving her skill as a warrior was immediately proven worthless against something Rudeus had only been training with for a week. Once again, Rudeus was back on this seemingly insurmountable pedestal. Of course, Ruijerd told her she possessed enough talent to surpass him, but to her that was nothing more than a lie intended to console her. To her, Rudeus was simply too far ahead to even catch up now. It was an endeavor she didn't even consider to be possible anymore. As the next few months were spent feeling as if all her efforts were pointless, it was her time in the Millis continent that had finally changed that. You see, not only did Eris learn that there were more ways to fight than with just swords and magic, but she was also able to see firsthand just how strong she'd become. After single-handedly fighting off a whole group of assassins, Eris was finally able to catch a glimpse of her own supposed talent. She still didn't think she was as strong as Ghislaine and Ruijerd were making her out to be, but perhaps they weren't lying whenever they made an effort to recognize it. So it was here during this small adventure with goblins and assassins that Eris's confidence would be somewhat restored a bit. Now, as she tried her best to be of use to Rudeus after this, every opportunity to do so seemed to resolve itself before she could do anything. Rudeus would either end up taking care of it himself, or the skills she'd worked so hard to acquire simply weren't needed. It was a series of events that only went to further highlight just how great Rudeus was. It was as she did, though, that Eris finally came to realize just how young Rudy was. This intimate moment with the person she loved the most forced her to come to terms with exactly what she'd been doing these past few years. She'd been so caught up in her own self-made image of Rudius's magnificence that she completely forgot who it was she'd been relying on. Not once did she think to remember how Rudy was still a child a couple years younger than her. So, when that revelation had finally sunk in, that was the moment in which Eris knew she couldn't be with him. The fact they'd become family would always remain true, but there was no way she could ever hope to become more than that. With the way she was now, Eris knew she'd only end up holding him back. She knew she would only end up taking advantage of his kindness. That's not to say she was giving up on the idea of becoming his wife, but it also wasn't a path she'd pursue until she was stronger. Only after she could stand beside Rudius as an equal would Eris return to start a family with him. Until that time would come, though, Eris knew that there was a long and arduous path ahead of her. If she wanted to become the swordswoman befitting a mage like Rudius, then she knew that the first step was to head towards the Sword Sanctum. There she would follow in Gawain's footsteps and learn the techniques of the Sword God style. Now, as for why she left with such a cryptic letter, well, that's simply because she didn't know what else to say. She did consider the options of saying goodbye or leaving a note, but she felt that those could lead to Rudius following her. Of course, she also considered leaving without saying a word, but she also didn't want Rudius to hate her. What mattered most here was making sure that Rudius could move forward. So, rather than leave quietly into the night or with some emotional goodbye, Eris simply chose a brief and straightforward letter. 2 sentences which she was sure Rudius would eventually come to understand. As we know though, Eris's letter had pretty much the exact opposite effect. Out of all the reasons Rudius could come up with for why Eris left, the most plausible was the one where she just didn't like him anymore. To him, the past few years had just gone to show how much of a failure he was. Sure, they did make it back home relatively safe, but with all the trouble he had caused along the way, it only made sense that Eris would want to leave after. There was no way she'd want to stay with someone who was so stagnant and incompetent. That's the conclusion that Rudius had come to. It was as he did, though, that Rudius suddenly remembered that he had another mission, the one where he needed to search for Zenith. But unlike in the anime, there was no flashback showing a fond memory of him and his mother. It was just him remembering that he still had family to find. That said, this heartfelt scene, which had actually taken place all the way back in Volume 1, was quite crucial in highlighting Rudius's one step forward. Though it was mostly intended to show how much Zenith loved him, the novel takes it further by highlighting Rudius's importance. You see, not only was Rudy reliable when it came to pretty much everything, but the way he saved their family was something Zenith was forever grateful for. Had he not intervened like the way he did, then Zenith's own morals wouldn't have allowed her to stay in the same household anymore. Her upbringing as a pious member of the Millis Church would have resulted in either her or Lilia being ousted. So, when Rudy had come to play the part of the innocent child, even if Zenith did know he wasn't telling the truth, his expression was more than enough to quell her anger. Just the fact that Rudy had showed such concern for the state of his family was much more important than the mistake Paul had made. It's for that very reason that Zenith knew moments like this were only possible because of Rudy. And that's the core purpose of this scene here. It was meant to highlight the familial bond Rudy had made with Zenith, a bond strong enough to push him forward and grant him a whole new purpose. Now, everything else we see in the episode is pretty much a segue into the future arcs. The whole encounter with Roxy and Kashitika, as well as the post-credit scene with the second princess, were all cliffhanger moments tailored for the season finale. Of course, the novel does go more in depth with each of those scenes, but I'm fairly certain we were shown exactly what we needed to see. So I think that's where we're going to end it for this season of Mushoku Tensei Cut content. If you've been here since episode 1, then allow me to thank you for all the support the past few months. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!